I seem to have lost my sound check. Emma, are you still there?
Yes, we can hear you, and we're just about to start. So I will start the... Yes, so welcome everybody to the virtual hearing for the Inquiry into Budget Estimates 2021-2022. Before I commence, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people who are the traditional custodians of the land on which Parliament sits. I'd like to pay respect to the elders past, present and emerging of the Eora Nation and extend that respect to other Aboriginals viewing this broadcast. Today, the committee will examine the proposed expenditure for the portfolio of Treasury. Today's hearing is being conducted as a fully virtual hearing, which enables the work of the committee to continue during the COVID-19 pandemic without compromising the health and safety of members, witnesses and staff. As we break new ground with technology, I would ask for everyone's patience through any technical difficulties we may encounter today. If participants lose their internet connection and are disconnected from the virtual hearing, they're asked to rejoin the hearing by using the same link as provided by the committee secretariat. Before we commence, I'd like to make some brief comments about the procedures for today's hearing. There may be some questions that a witness could only answer if they had more time or with certain documents to hand. In these circumstances, witnesses are advised that they can take a question on notice and provide the answer within 21 days. All witnesses in budget estimates have a right to procedural fairness in accordance with the Procedural Fairness Resolution adopted by the House in 2018. Today's proceedings are being broadcast live from Parliament's YouTube channel, and a transcript will be placed on the committee's website once it becomes available. Finally, a few notes on virtual hearing etiquette to minimise disruptions and assist our Hansard reporters. Can I ask committee members to clearly identify who questions are directed to, and could I ask everyone to please state their name when they begin speaking? Could everyone please mute their microphones when they're not speaking? Please remember to turn your microphones back on when you're getting ready to speak. If you start speaking whilst muted, please start your question or answer again so that it can be recorded in the transcript. Members and witnesses should avoid speaking over each other so that we can all be heard clearly. Also, to assist Hansard, may I remind members and witnesses to speak directly into the microphone and avoid making comments when your head is turned away. All witnesses will be sworn in prior to giving evidence. So I will start with the Treasury officials. Mr. Pratt, could you please state your full name and position title and swear either an oath or affirmation from the cards that have been emailed to you by the Secretariat? Treasury, you're on mute. Okay, you're still on mute.
Can you hear me now, Chair?
Thank you. Yep.
Okay, good. Good morning. Michael Thomas Pratt, Secretary of Treasury. I swear that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help me God.
Thank you, Ms. Wilkie. If you could state your full name, position, title, and swear either an oath or affirmation.
Joanne Louise Wilkie, Deputy Secretary, Economic Strategy and Productivity, New South Wales Treasury. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Mr. Maida, if you could state your name, position, title and swear either an oath or affirmation.
Thank you. Sanjeev Mehta, Deputy Secretary, Policy and Budget at Treasury. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Mr. Gardner.
Good morning, Philip Lloyd Gardner. I'm Deputy Secretary of Commercial and Procurement in New South Wales Treasury. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Mr. Walters.
Good morning, Stephen Bradley Walters, Chief Economist, New South Wales Treasury. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Mr Ackerstrat?
Good morning. Peter Charles Ackerstrat, New South Wales Productivity Commissioner. I swear that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help me God.
Thank you. And Mr Deverill?
David Michael Deverill, Chief Executive of New South Wales Treasury Corporation. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thanks, everybody. So today's hearing will be conducted from 9:30 to 11 a.m. And then from 11:15 a.m. to 12:45 a.m. with questions from the opposition and crossbench members only. If required, an additional 15 minutes is allocated at the end of the hearing for government questions. There's no provision for any witnesses to make an opening statement before the committee commences questioning, so we will begin with questions from the opposition.
Good morning, Treasury officials, and good morning to the Productivity Commissioner and to the CEO of TCorp. Thank you for joining us this morning, and can I firstly just convey something on behalf of this committee, I'm sure, just our thanks to all the staff at the Treasury and your respective agencies for the work that's been performed during the lockdown. Treasury Secretary, through you, to you, and I presume the Chief Economist, I was just going to ask you if you could kick off by giving us an update as to how the economy is faring. And specifically, are you in a position to address the size of the contraction of the New South Wales economy this quarter, how much you think we are likely to contract in the next quarter, and how many jobs we have lost since lockdown?
Thanks, Mr. Mookhey. I might get Mr. Walters to answer that question and give you the details. So, Mr. Walters, thank you.
Mr. Mookhey, so we've got various scenarios that attempt to forecast the size of contraction in the economy this quarter. We don't have a precise number on that because clearly we're in the midst of the quarter still. There's another 7 or 8 weeks to go before the end of the quarter. And we don't have a clarity on where the case numbers will go. The outcome for the economy depends very much on where the case numbers go and how long the restrictions last. So we don't actually have a forecast of what the contraction will be. But the consensus of private sector economists is that there will be a contraction in both state final demand for New South Wales in the current quarter and probably a decline in national GDP in the current quarter. As for Q4, the December quarter, we don't have a forecast for Q4 apart from what was in the budget. But again, the consensus of private sector economists is that there'll be positive growth in the December quarter. As for the number of jobs that have been lost in the lockdown, we saw in the July employment numbers were released yesterday, and New South Wales lost around 36,000 jobs over the month of July. That is the latest information we have on the impact of the restrictions on the labour market.
Thank you for that update. Just to follow up on that, can you give us an update as to the contraction in hours worked in the New South Wales economy and how that fared compared to the Victorian lockdown last year? And equally, can you just follow up on the question about the private sector consensus around contraction in this quarter? I understand that consensus is somewhere between a range of sort of 5 to 8%. Is that what you think as well?
So in terms of hours worked, we saw, again in the July labour force numbers yesterday, a 7% drop in hours worked across the New South Wales labour force. The contraction in Victoria last year was more than that. I don't have the exact number for Victoria. I can take that on notice and return with that answer. But the contraction in New South Wales last year was more than that in terms of hours worked. But again, the latest numbers we have is a 7% contraction in hours worked over the month of July. In terms of the consensus of economists, that is my understanding. The forecasts change frequently, but that's my understanding of the consensus expects something around, for New South Wales at least, somewhere around the 5% to 8% mark you mentioned. The contraction that those economists expect for the national economy will be smaller than that. because other parts of the economy are not in the same level of restrictions as New South Wales, Victoria or Queensland.
Thank you, Chief Economist. Do you expect New South Wales to enter a recession?
Well, by recession, I assume you mean consecutive quarters of falling output, in which case...
the technical definition of recession.
Yeah, well, that's a widely used definition. It's not particularly one I particularly enjoy using for all sorts of reasons, but and a technical problem for a state jurisdiction is we don't get gross state product on a quarterly basis. We only get a state final demand measure on a quarterly basis. So we'll never actually know if New South Wales suffers a quarterly decline in gross state product across 2 quarters, in the same way that we didn't know that last year. Hence my reticence to use that definition. We saw negative quarters of GDP growth consecutively nationally last year. So that was clearly a recession on the definition you were using. And I think it's widely accepted that Australia's economy had a recession last year. Whether New South Wales has back-to-back quarters of declining state final demand will depend very much on where the case numbers go. My expectation is we'll probably have a negative quarter of state final demand in the current quarter. I'm not forecasting that, but that seems to be on the current trajectory where output may go. And again, the consensus of private sector economists tends to suggest the same thing. I still think it's unlikely we'll get consecutive quarters of declining state final demand. And that's based on the amount of policy support that's out there, both from the Commonwealth Government, the state government, the Reserve Bank, and also experience from last year that when restrictions are eased, we saw that the economy recovered very, very quickly. And as you know, economists like to deploy letters of the alphabet to describe the shape of the economic recovery. It was very much a V-shaped recovery last year, and we have the same sort of expectation this year.
Thank you, Chief Economist. Can I just ask you, I guess my final question on this line of questioning, is are you in a position to provide us with and this is either to you, Treasury Secretary, or any of the other officials as well, any information about where the job loss impact is most concentrated? I'm especially interested in how Western and Southwest Sydney is faring relative to the rest of Sydney and the rest of New South Wales, and whether or not we do have any information about the impact on smaller businesses in those particular geographies as well.
Mr. Mookhey, we don't get that sort of granular level of detail, unfortunately. What we do get is statewide estimates of employment, and as I said, there was a decline yesterday through the month of July. We don't get it by geographic area, particularly local government areas, which I think is what you're alluding to. So unfortunately, we don't have a lot of information on that.
Thank you, Chief Economist. Mr. Pratt, can I just turn now to the support programs, especially in the context it's just been described by the Chief Economist. I just want to start with both the grants and the JobSaver program. I have been inundated. I'm sure government members, opposition members and crossbench members have just been inundated with businesses, small businesses especially, who have been complaining about the inability to access this. It's been described to me as a debacle. Do you think it's been a debacle in terms of how it's rolled out?
I wouldn't use that word, Mr. Mookhey. It's certainly been difficult, but maybe to give you some context, I mean, a month ago, we had no capability to make the payments that we're now making today under the various grants programs. So Customer Service Cluster with Service New South Wales have had to build this capability. And basically, I liken it to, you know, they're in the air flying the plane and they're still building the plane in the air. So it's been very challenging for them. They have made real progress in the month. And I've got some latest numbers, Mr. Mookhey, if you're interested in, as of last night, which I could give you. And
I
there has
absolutely
been,
welcome it, but I'm aware that those numbers are being published on the website, which I've got to say is it's a welcome innovation from last year as well. But if you've got any quick updates, that would be most useful.
I'll just give you the quick updates, and the numbers that I look most at, which I think would be the ones that you'd be most interested in, is the actual amount that's gone to bank accounts. And for the grants, so the business grants, which was the first grant program that we ran, has now had 992.63 million into bank accounts as of last night. And that's actually gone up around 98 million to the night before. The micro business grants, the amount gone to bank accounts is 60.55 million. And the JobSaver grants, which is the grant that's funded 50-50 with the Commonwealth, is 702.49 million. So in the space of a few weeks, you know, if you look at what's gone out, that's around $1.6 billion. So yes, it's been challenging and it remains that way. But what I can say to you, there is a huge commitment within customer service to get on top of this and manage the backlog. They've got over 500 staff deployed on this, and there's a very strong commitment, understanding that the important thing here is to get this money out the door and into bank accounts.
So, Treasury Secretary, is it your view that customer service cluster and Service New South Wales in particular are responsible for the design of the rollout?
Largely, yes. The policy positions are from Treasury and they are agreed at Expenditure Review Committee. And it is really the responsibility of customer service then to decide the payment framework and then to make those payments.
Thank you. Just in respect to the JobSaver program, is it the case that we would have avoided all this trauma with the rollout if we had in fact brought back JobKeeper?
Well, our position with the Commonwealth when we entered this second phase of COVID and started to understand the implications was to ask for JobKeeper to be returned, and the Treasurer was, I think, quite public on that, Mr Mookhey, as well. That was our preference, yes, to your question. The Commonwealth would not undertake to doing that, so the program that we designed was as much as one can do relative to what JobKeeper did with the JobSaver program. And as you're probably aware, the JobKeeper program was paid to individuals through companies. The JobSaver program, the one we have now in place with the Commonwealth, is paid to businesses. So there is a difference in the way this is deployed.
Indeed. But did it, at any point, the Commonwealth offer to distribute the JobSaver program to small businesses?
There was some discussion on that point around who takes responsibility for distribution. The Commonwealth were keen for the state to do that, and they recognised that New South Wales, I would think around all the states, Mr Mookhey, probably had the best capability in place to do that. And so it was agreed then that New South Wales would take that responsibility for deployment.
With whom in the Commonwealth was these negotiations had?
That would have been Treasurer to Treasurer. So
on the rollout of the program specifically, not official to official?
And yes, and then from the Secretary of Treasury with myself in the Commonwealth, and also our various officials. So there was a numbers of people involved in this.
Sure. So Treasury Secretary, in respect to the conversations you had with your counterpart at the Commonwealth levels, did the Commonwealth say that they could have done it faster if they were distributing it?
Not to my recollection, not to me, no.
Can I ask, in respect to a media report that's emerged that says, from the Commonwealth really, that they had made an offer to New South Wales for them to distribute this program to the businesses, was that briefing from the Commonwealth wrong?
Look, I don't know, I'm not a party to all discussions, Mr Mookhey, as you'd appreciate, but certainly this option was discussed between the Commonwealth Treasury Secretary and myself, and I'm sure it was discussed with other officials. But as I've indicated, we felt, given the progress of Service New South Wales and the fact that Commonwealth would have had to have stood up this program themselves, we thought the need to get money into bank accounts and split it to market, this was the best option to take.
Now that we've had all the problems that have emerged since, do you still maintain the view that this was the best option for New South Wales to take?
Yes, I do, because as I understand it, the Commonwealth don't have that payment framework in place now.
And at any point, did the Treasurer or you ask the Commonwealth to distribute the program or to take over the program?
I'm sorry, Mr. Mookhey, could you just repeat that?
At any point, did the Treasurer or you ask the Commonwealth to distribute this program in order to facilitate the faster payments to the tens of thousands of small businesses in New South Wales?
Look, what I can say, it was part of the broader option discussion, yes. Backwards and forwards. I mean, we were throwing around what were the best options to get this done as quickly as possible.
Just to be clear, at some point you asked them and they refused?
Well, I wouldn't say formally asked them. I would say it was part of a broader discussion that I've indicated about what are the options to get this money paid quickly. And that was one of the options for the Commonwealth to do it.
And did the Treasury conclude that that was the New South Wales Treasury conclude that that wasn't a preferred option for the reasons you just stated, that the Commonwealth would have to stand it up in quick order?
Yes, it wasn't only us though. It was discussions, obviously, as I've indicated, with Commonwealth Treasury, and I'm sure Treasurer to Treasurer in the Commonwealth as well.
Are there any conversations happening right now with the Commonwealth in order to facilitate any additional Commonwealth assistance for the New South Wales economy?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
And are we in a position, I understand, of course, the cost of the lockdown stimulus programs that have been announced so far, but do we have a projection as to what the peak weekly cost of JobSaver will be to New South Wales?
We don't at this point, because that depends a lot on how long these current set of restrictions continue and the lockdown zones as well as part of that. So at this point, no. At the moment,
what is the current weekly cost? What is the current weekly cost of JobSaver?
The provision for the cost is 500 million, and 250 million of that is from the Commonwealth. So it's a 50-50 share. Now that is the amount that's provided. That the actual amounts I don't have with me on a weekly basis.
So is that, sorry, when you say 250 million to New South Wales for a $500 million program, is that per week or is that across the life of the program?
That's per week.
Okay. And do we have any indication as to whether or not all $250 million is being distributed per week, or 500 million, depending on your? Yeah, we'll go with 500 million.
I'll just check with Ms. Mookhey. I don't have weekly numbers, but if we can get them for you, Mr. Mookhey, we will.
Mr. Mookhey, it's Joanne Mookhey here. The total amount paid, which includes total initial and recurring payments under JobSaver, as Mr. Pratt has already said, is in the order of 700 million. So that's going to we can make some estimates about the weekly numbers, or fortnightly numbers based on the number of
inference is, if we budgeted to spend $500 million per week and we are 7 weeks into lockdown and potentially, I think, 5 weeks since the announcement of the program, having only spent 700 million, we're well below what we should have been spending on this program, aren't we? Is that an incorrect inference?
No, that's not a correct inference. The program was not announced on the 26th of June. This program was announced in early July, and payments were paid from the 18th of July and available from a turnover period starting from the 18th of July. So your inference is not correct.
Okay. I'm happy to take on notice, Mr. Mookhey. I can get weekly numbers for you if you'd like me to do that.
Thank you. That would be most helpful. I'm just going to pass to my colleague now just to pursue some other questions.
Thanks very much. I just have one particular question, which is really about the support for major events. Blues Fest was cancelled on the basis of public health orders in earlier this year, there was a commitment in April from the Treasurer to develop an insurance or support program for the covering of these costs of these events and the losses that are made. My understanding is there's been some discussion with the industry about this, but it has not proceeded. Could someone please update me on the status of that?
Yes, look, to my knowledge, there is the intention to create a fund. Some work was done on that, and as I understand it at the moment, that is with the Minister for Industry and Jobs.
Would you be able to give the committee some update on the timing where you expect that to be resolved? Obviously, it's a significant issue with major events being cancelled, or between now and the end of the year.
I'm happy to take that on notice. I don't have that with me.
And also just to be clear, so Treasury are not dealing with it now. It's now is that Minister Ayres?
It's with Minister Ayres. So I'm just checking. Ms. Wilkie has an update here. Do you want to give that update? Yeah.
So Ms. Sharpe, Joanne Wilkie here. In addition to the assistance that you're talking about, which, as Mr. Pratt has just said, is with the Minister for Industry and Jobs, the government has already announced a live music and performing arts support measure, which is available for performing arts or live music venues, producers and promoters. It is administered by Create New South Wales. Cash payments for eligible proponents are calculated on the basis of a proportion of the likely revenue lost due to a cancelled or a postponed performance. It covers the entire lockdown period, and people can apply through Create New South Wales for that. Application was opened on the 23rd of July.
And so just one last follow-up. I know my time's coming to an end, but just to be clear, there is still the intention and commitment to put in place an insurance scheme.
The issue that I've raised is with the Minister of Jobs and Industry. I'm not sure whether we call that an insurance scheme, Ms. Sharpe, but that is work in progress. That is separate from what Ms. Wilkie has just given you.
And just, sorry, my final one is the festivals. Festivals are ineligible for the funds that you've just outlined, Ms. Wilkie. Is that right?
I would have to take that on notice and check that with Create New South Wales.
You come back to us. That's great. My time for the moment's up. Thank you.
We'll come back to that. So crossbench, Ms. Boyd.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you to all of you for attending this morning. I guess I'll start us by talking first about the Transport Asset Holding Entity. Apologies, there's a little bit of interference. I'm not on mute, Chair. Yep.
It's just muted.
Thank you. There we go. All right. Sorry, I was having difficulty hearing myself. Let's talk about the Transport Asset Holding Entity first. As you know, it's been in the news. There's some perplexing aspects to this entity. Can I just take us back in 2015 when Tahi was first set up, and perhaps I'll direct this question to you first, Mr. Pratt. That was set up at the time when the Premier was Treasurer, correct?
I have to check that date.
I believe it was 1 July 2015.
Oh, yes, right.
Yes, I have it. Yes, that's correct then, Ms. Boyd, yes.
And so that was just after the state election, and just prior to that, the Premier was the Minister for Transport, I believe. Had this idea been floated before that election? Where did this idea originate to put these assets into an off-balance sheet entity?
Ms. Boyd, it might help then if I give you just an overview of the timing. Would that be helpful?
Thank you.
So this issue, I mean, obviously a number of us weren't here at the time, but goes back to 2013-14 when the ABS did a national review of transport assets. And coming out of that, the government, following that, first flagged its intention to create Tahi in 13-14 as a response to that ABS review. In 15-16, it was announced as part of the 15-16 budget and was included in that budget. The Audit Office have reviewed the arrangements, and there has been unqualified audit reports on the total sector account since that time. In 15-17, the Tahi project was led by the Transport Secretary and the Transport Minister to develop the legislation for Tahi. And then in 2017, the Tahi legislation was passed in Parliament. In February 19, and through that period, we worked to then set up Tahi as a state-owned corporation. So that's the journey. And then in July 20, Tahi was formally proclaimed as a state-owned corporation within the transport cluster. And the majority independent board was appointed. So that gives you, I hope, a sense of the timeline.
That's helpful. Thank you. The impact of setting up Tahi was, I understand it, designed to take those assets off balance sheet from an accounting perspective. Were rating agencies' methodologies also important in that decision? Do you know?
Look, rating agencies are one part of that decision, but the primary driver, and I'll just give you these details of why the government did this. I mean, there was an ABS review which generated this in the first place, as I've mentioned. But in terms of setting up the entity itself, and I'll just give you the purpose in the Act. And that is firstly to optimise the existing transport asset base to enable a more effective, efficient and commercial approach to the management of transport assets, particularly property, and then also allowing transport entities to focus on their core functions of operating transport services and delivering improved customer service. Now, this is a consistent view, I guess, across a lot of the state-owned corporations where you get a better focus and stronger focus on efficiency and operations by having state-owned corporations with an independent board and CEO. So Tahi was no different to that.
Is it correct, though, to say that the effect of this was to effectively boost the operating budget by its reported $30 billion over the past 6 years? So it made the overall budget for the state look pretty good, didn't it?
Well, it improved the budget, yes, but it was subject to all the accounting rules of any other state-owned corporation. So there was no attempt to do anything that wasn't in accord with the accounting practice and rules.
No, okay, understood. But then the accounting rules changed in 2018. Which left Tahi as an entity that then needed to be adjusted in some way, or you would end up with that impact coming back onto the budget. Is that correct?
I'll get Mr. Mida, Ms. Boyd, to talk to the 218. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Boyd. Sam Beha here. So it's all these assets were sitting in RealCorp. So RealCorp already had the existing assets. What ABS had pointed out was to continue its treatment as a separate entity and the PNFC. It needed to have a separate governance structure and it needed to be commercial. So, and what that meant was the creation of Tahi separated the operators, which is Sydney Trains and New South Wales Trains, out of RealCorp, and those assets moved out. So the operators are separate to the holding entity. The entity owns the assets, the real assets, which the operators pay an access fee. So that hasn't changed. What had happened? So there were some conversations on how we did look at the accounting changes that happened. There was the leasing standards and the service concession standards and how it would apply right across government. So this meant we started this work in February 2019, where we had one standard had already changed in 18 and one was changing. Sorry, one had changed in 19 and one was changing in 20, and we want to know the impact on all assets right across the sector, and that included Tahi. So we went into a fair bit of detail to understand whether anything we were doing with Tahi and setting it up would be affected by that. the model that we had started post legislation to try and implement hadn't changed. It is exactly the same model, which is it has an independence and governance structure, and it has a pathway to commercialization for it to be an independent SOC.
But can we just be clear when we talk about, yes, but the accounting standards changed, and so the government needed to change. What actually happened was that the government had taken advantage, I guess, of an accounting trick to push assets off balance sheet in order to make the operating budget look better. And you may debate whether that's why it was done, but that was the effect. When the accounting standards came in, you did have the choice, didn't you, to just actually bring those assets back on balance sheet. You didn't have to proceed with the potential commercialisation of Tahi.
So that had been legislated in 2017. There was nothing in the accounting standard that stopped that legislation being implemented. So all we were doing was proceeding with the implementation of the legislation. So to be bring it back, so you said to take it out of the PNFC and put it back into government sector would require new legislation to stop SOC being created. It wasn't a Treasury option, Ms. Boyd.
So when the PwC report recommended that the transport, states transport networks were basically corporatized, I understand there was another report obtained at that time from KPMG. Is that correct?
So the two different things. So the PwC report was initiated by Transport for them to also understand impacts of accounting changes on Tahi. We were doing it for the whole sector. That was what KPMG is for us. We have chosen KPMG as a partner who have a very strong accounting and finance practice that we get advice on accounting standards. And they were providing us with advice of all assets across the sector and included Tahi. So we started that in about February 2019 with KPMG, and that work continued. And then when we were looking at further implementation of Tahi, they continued to provide advice on the structuring of Tahi. So it met with the Australian Bureau of Statistics standards, and it met with the accounting standards to meet with the auditor requirements. So there were two different pieces of work.
Just a final question before I need to hand over to my colleagues. What would be the impact other than an increase in the operating budget? If the decision was made, it seems to me we had the decision whether to corporatise, and we can say, well, there was legislation pushing that. That doesn't mean there's not options to unwind it. If we were to actually make that decision to not proceed with the independence and corporatisation of Tahi, but instead to recognise that it no longer qualifies under the accounting standards. In addition to the operating budget impact, would it also have an impact on the ratings of the state under the rating agency methodology?
Not necessarily. I'd have to look at that more closely and come back, but not necessarily.
Thank you. I need to hand over to my colleagues.
Thank you, Mr. Latham.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks to the officials who are here today. Could I come back to the points that Mr. Mookhey was raising earlier on with Mr. Walters about economic forecasting and the impact of the current lockdowns? Mr. Walters, on page 1.3 of budget paper number 1, it reads, the forecast for 2021-22 is for economic growth of 3.25%. How does the Treasury arrive at that figure at the time of the budget?
Mr. Latham, we go through a fairly detailed forecasting round. So we have, as you understand, quite a few macroeconomists in our staff, and we go through a very detailed bottom-up forecasting process, looking at every aspect of the economy from the biggest sector of the economy, consumers, through the other private parts of the economy like business investment, dwelling investment, and then also public demand. So we look at public investment, public consumption, and then the net export sector as well, exports minus imports, and then come up with a forecast on an additive basis of all of those components. And that's how we arrive at a forecast of gross state product.
Yeah, sure. And why aren't you doing that work now in the middle of this economic crisis to give the crisis cabinet up-to-date information about the impact of their lockdown policies on the New South Wales economy?
Well, your suggestion is we're not forecasting the economy. My team forecasts the economy every day. What I was alluding to in my earlier question was we don't have a formal forecast that is published as against what was in the budget. The budget is the last published forecast, but my team and myself monitor the economy at all times. What we haven't been able to do, though, given the nature of the pandemic and the rapid changes in what's happening in the economy, is formulate that full forecasting round to come up with a final gross state product number. So we have clearly monitoring the economy, but we don't have a full forecast for gross state product because that takes some weeks to formulate. To do it properly, we'd like to do this properly rather than just take a guess. We don't do that.
Okay, it takes weeks to do it. We're 2 months into this lockdown with huge economic damage right across New South Wales. You say you monitor every day and you forecast every day. What is the daily information you give to the Treasurer to carry to the crisis cabinet so they've got a handle on the vast economic damage that's being caused?
Well, the information I provide to the Treasurer to go to Crisis Policy Committee is cabinet in confidence, so I can't share that with you now.
Did you do that on a daily basis, given you told us that you monitor daily and forecast daily?
We certainly monitor daily and we inform our forecast daily. Whether that information goes to the Treasurer daily, I'm not aware. I don't brief the Treasurer every day, and Mr. Pratt may, and Mr. Pratt certainly has access to the information that I provide.
So Mr. Latham, I just add to that, what I get from Mr. Walters and the economic team is an update for each crisis cabinet. So I give that to the Treasurer and that's taken into crisis cabinet.
But today here at this budget estimate, you've got no up-to-date forecast information about the impact of this lockdown on economic growth.
No, that's not correct. I get regular updates, as Mr. Walters indicated, on the cost of restrictions. That is a key area of focus right now, as you appreciate. And I take that information with the Treasurer into crisis cabinet.
And what are the cost of restrictions?
Well, I'm unable to, that is cabinet in confidence. I'm unable to talk about that.
You're unable to tell the people of New South Wales and many thousands of businesses bleeding to death about the impact of these lockdown policies on their livelihood, their businesses, and for the people of New South Wales, our state's economic growth. What's the point in having a Treasury?
Well, that's not my decision, Mr. Latham, but what I can say is we are incredibly committed to supporting the people of New South Wales. I've just talked earlier about the extensive grant programs that we've put in place, but it's not my decision about what goes public in way of information.
When does the Treasury plan to publish an upgraded economic growth forecast?
That would be at the half year, so there is the formal process that Mr. Walters has indicated. That will kick off in the next month and that will be updated in the half year update.
Is the Treasury monitoring levels of business confidence in New South Wales, Mr. Walters and Mr. Pratt? And what is the impact on business confidence of the bewildering, erratic array of government announcements about economic freedom in our state related to the vaccination rates? Because people are completely confused. I get contacted, as I'm sure members of the committee do, daily from businesses who lost confidence in this government because they can't understand where the policymakers are headed. Is it 50% vaccination rate? Is it 70? Is it 80? Is it 80 plus low COVID numbers? What advice is Treasury giving to the government about the need to have one stable, reliable plan for opening up the economy at some stage to give business some degree of hope and confidence?
I'll get Mr. Walters to talk to business confidence initially. Thank you.
So, Mr. Latham, we do monitor business confidence. There are a couple of surveys that we particularly favour. One is published by NAB, the National Australia Bank, and that shows both business confidence and conditions. Business confidence has fallen quite sharply, so it is actually a negative net balance now. It's quite comparable to what happened during 2020, although I would say that the fall in confidence so far has been less than half that during 2020, during the initial phase of the pandemic. We're coming off also a record high on that measure just 4 months ago. So we've had quite a remarkable recovery in business confidence. In fact, as I said, it's never been higher in New South Wales until the onset of this new phase of the pandemic, in which confidence has fallen very sharply. Now that's not a surprise, but it is the main measure of business confidence we follow, and it is a negative net balance at the moment.
What is the Treasury advice to government about the need for one reliable medium and long-term plan for reopening the economy that business can look to and think that is the plan, rather than the bewildering array of new announcements every other day, including one in the Australian newspaper today leaked out, which quite frankly, if you can understand it, you'll need the Rosetta Stone to make out what it means.
I mean, as you'd expect, and I think as you've indicated, Mr. Latham, Treasury is doing constant work on these issues. And this work is supplied to the Treasurer and in the Crisis Cabinet. And Crisis Cabinet rightly debates both the health and the economic implications.
Yeah, but that's not answering my question, Mr. Pratt. Have you advised the government that they need one reliable medium to long-term plan business sector can rely on for the reopening of the economy, rather than a bewildering array of erratic announcements every other day?
I'm unable to talk about that level of detail, Mr. Latham.
What can you talk about in terms of giving businesses confidence that this government would have one plan that the business sector, people who work hard, their livelihoods on the line, can rely on to know where the hell this great policy mess is headed?
Well, you're asking me questions of policy, which I'm unable to comment on. What I can say, as I've indicated earlier, is that Treasury is working very hard to do all they can to support the people and the businesses of New South Wales.
Mr. Pratt, in your budget paper number 1, page 5.1, it states right at the top of the expenditure outline, expenses in this budget continue the state's world-leading response to the pandemic. How's that going?
Well, I would say last year, New South Wales was clearly acknowledged as the leader in both dealing with the pandemic and dealing with the economy. Clearly, this latest Delta strain is a very different proposition, and this year has been very challenging, but no different to every other state, I'd suggest.
In the budget paper you've said here, written by the Treasury, we were world leading in our response to the pandemic. Where do you think we rank now?
I don't know, Mr. Latham. I can't answer that question.
Do you think we're still world leading?
Well, it depends what measures, set of metrics you might use. I'm not prepared to comment on that.
Your statement, you obviously have some metrics in mind. Where do you think we rank now?
Well, it was acknowledged, as I said, by all and sundry last year that New South Wales had done quite an exceptional job.
What about today?
Well, I don't have metrics that I can give you. I mean, clearly we are struggling today, so
lost them.
No, we are clearly struggling, but so is everybody else with this latest Delta strain.
Okay. Has the Treasury done any work on the extent of the cash economy in the hotspot local government areas in Western Sydney?
Not that I'm aware of, no. No, we haven't.
Not in the distant past and not in the last 2 months? What does Treasury think of the idea that there's a substantial cash economy where people are participating in economic activities where they don't QR code and they certainly don't tell the contact tracers where they've been or indeed where they're going?
That's more likely a question for the customer service cluster. That's not something the Treasury gets involved in, Mr. Latham.
Right, Treasury.
Treasury.
Oh, sorry, I'll let you finish your answer and then.
That's fine. Yeah. Customer service cluster and police.
Thanks. The opposition.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Secretary, I'd like to resume questioning about the transport asset holding entity. Why has Treasury let a corporation responsible for controlling $40 billion of public assets go without a permanent CEO for 13 months?
Well, that's not a Treasury decision, Mr. Mookhey. That is, once legislation's passed and this is an entity that is in place, that is the responsibility of the state-owned corporation, in this case Tahi, with an independent board and with the chair. That is for them to do that, not us.
The Treasurer executed a shareholder agreement with the board of Tahi last year, which has been tabled in Parliament, and it says that Tahi is meant to have a permanent CEO in place by the end of 2020, 2021, and following on from that, that permanent CEO should have already have gone through a performance appraisal. Given that that was an agreement executed by the Treasurer, and given that that is an agreement that Treasury provided advice to the Treasury on, how have you let this organisation go without a CEO for 13 months?
Well, the Treasurer nor the Treasury are not responsible for the appointment of the CEO. That is clearly the responsibility of the SOC, in this case Tahi. As I understand it, they had a CEO that was acting, who unfortunately had a serious health issue. During this time, they were looking to recruit a permanent CEO, which they've recently announced. Now, we have not been, and rightly, I might say, not engaged in that process. That is for transport and the asset entity itself in Tahi.
But Mr. Pratt, the Treasury is responsible for governance at state-owned corporations. The Act gives you the power to step in and tell the board, particularly when they are in breach of the shareholder agreement. Why didn't Treasury ever tell Tahi's board that it was unacceptable to leave the leadership of a $40 billion organisation vacant for more than a year?
Well, the leadership wasn't vacant. They did have an acting CEO who came from transport and therefore had subject matter knowledge. And during this time, they were running a recruitment process. Now, I'm sure they would say, if you asked them, Mr. Mookhey, that took longer than they would have liked, but they did have a process running.
Well, in respect to that recruitment process, the Treasurer told me this week through a question on notice that the Tahi CEO was recruited from a process whereby an ad was placed on the I Work New South Wales government website and some Transport for New South Wales internal websites, and the position was only advertised from the 12th of February to the 22nd of February. Why is it acceptable for one of the state-owned corporations, a massive state-owned corporation, to only have a 10-day recruitment process for its CEO?
I can't comment on that specific ad because I'm not aware of it, but what I am aware of is that they were running a much more significant process with an independent headhunter, one of the big firms, as you'd expect, and I think the context of your question is quite right, but that is the process they were doing. So I don't know, I can't comment on that ad.
Which big firm were they using?
You'd have to ask them, Mr. Mookhey.
But you're aware of it, you just made reference to it, Mr. Pratt.
Yes, I'm aware that they were using a headhunting firm, but I've not been engaged in that process.
Sure, but did Treasury approve the process that Tahi was embarking upon to select its CEO, like Treasury has done for other state-owned corporations?
Well, we don't always get engaged in a process to replace the CEO. That is really the responsibility of the state-owned enterprise.
I didn't ask. I asked you whether or not this particular process.
No, we haven't been engaged. I mean, I certainly haven't. I'll check with Mr. Minor, but
no, we haven't been engaged. We haven't been consulted on.
Did the Treasurer approve the selection process that was utilised to select the CEO?
I don't know, Mr. Mookhey. I can take that on notice if you'd like me to.
But the Treasurer did, as did the Finance Minister, approve the CEO's remuneration. That's correct, isn't it?
That is correct. That is a requirement, yes.
And Mr. Gardner, I think it was you who provided the advice or the brief to the Treasurer, did you not?
It would come through my team to the Treasurer's office, that's correct.
Thank you. What is the CEO's remuneration?
I don't know off the top of my head.
I'd have to take that.
We'll take that on notice, Mr. Mookhey, or we don't have that with us.
If it's possible to get that figure before the hearing, that would be most useful. Is the CEO of Tahi eligible for a bonus?
Again, that's an issue for the Tahi board.
So,
yes, but
it's Mr. Gardner here. Mr. Mookhey, our commercial policy framework enables the board of all our SOCs to determine a variable remuneration component for their CEOs. And so the answer to that question is categorically yes. If the board determined that a bonus or a variable remuneration component was warranted, they have the policy allows that.
Indeed, but has that position been provided to the Tahi CEO, and did the Treasurer approve the granting of a bonus to the CEO, or the power to grant a bonus to the CEO of Tahi?
Well, the SOC itself has the power under the legislation to operate in a commercial manner and to determine the remuneration of its staff. So the Treasurer doesn't specifically have to permission that. It's part of the legislation, part of our commercial policy framework.
I'm aware of that, but I'm asking specifically, did the Treasurer commit? He doesn't have to, but has he?
I'll have to take that on notice and we'll come back to you, try and come back to you during the course of this hearing.
Thank you. Is Treasury aware of how many people applied for the position of Tahi CEO?
I'm unaware, Mr. Mookhey.
Do we have any awareness about how many candidates were offered the role?
Similarly, not aware.
Equally, do we have any awareness about whether one candidate accepted the offer but then withdrew after media scrutiny of Tahi?
No, not aware of that.
Yeah. Was any Treasury official approached to fill the job?
I'm not aware of that.
Did any Treasury official apply for the job?
I'd have to, well, I don't know personally.
Okay. Just turning to the shareholder agreement which the Treasurer executed with the Tahi board. It says that Tahi is required to increase its earnings from $48.9 million last financial year to $779.3 million this coming year. How is Tahi planning to increase its earnings by more than 1,400% in a single year?
So we don't have, so Tahi's, so can you just repeat the numbers again, please, Mr. Mookhey?
Well, I'm reading directly from the shareholder agreement. It says that Tahi is required to increase its earnings, or to be technical, its earnings before interest, tax, depreciation and amortisation from $48.9 million in financial year 2020-21 to $779.3 million at the end of 21-22. So to repeat the question, how is Tahi expecting to increase its earnings by 1,400% in a single year?
So Tahi's earnings are made up of the access fees that they get from the operators. Those access fees are ramping up. So that will, in the first year we were creating, we were setting up the Tahi SOC, and the access fees started from 21-22. So I'll have to take a notice to come up with exactly the difference, but it is made up of both access fees and non-regulated asset opportunities. So so there are two major sources of income.
The access fees are paid by people who access Tahi's network, correct?
That's right.
And that's Sydney trains and that's country trains?
New South Wales trains, that's correct.
They're the major users, aren't they?
That's right.
So where in the budget papers is it listed how much Sydney trains and the other train networks will pay Tahi to produce this $779 million earnings result?
So those numbers are part of the consolidated accounts that are in the budget papers. The details will be provided in the SOC when Tahi have its annual reports. that is developed for year one in September this year when they're published.
So on that then, Mr. Miller, you mentioned the need for Tahi to have an independent board and CEO to meet accounting standards. And equally, I think KPMG looked at the accounting impact across entities. Does the level of government control and level of subsidies provided to Sydney Trains impact on this accounting determination? And have the relevant accounting and classification authorities been updated?
Okay, just want to unpick, there's two questions in there. So,
does it impact on independence?
So, does the accounting treatment impact on independence?
No, I'm talking about the level of government control and subsidy of Sydney Trains and the other users of Tahi's network. Does that impact on the independence of Tahi?
No, there's two different things. So the operators are PNFCs and as part of the transport cluster, and the operators are separate to the Tahi SOC. They need to be independent in the term in the way that they manage their asset portfolio.
Okay. You said, Mr. Miller, that Tahi will be earning its profit really from payments made determined under the access pricing regime. Is the regulated access pricing regime determined by IPART operational?
That's right.
Is it operational right now?
It's determined by IPART. IPART make a recommendation, and then the government develops the pricing for.
Has IPART determined the regulated access pricing regime? We do use the IPART do make the recommendation, and they have made the recommendations for transport. They don't regulate Tahi. IPART don't regulate Tahi. I know they don't recognise. I'm aware of that. I'm aware that they don't regulate Tahi. I'm asking, have they determined, not provided advice, but have they actually determined the regulated access pricing regime?
I'll take that on notice, and I can come back to you later.
Given that the shareholder agreement says that that was meant to be done by 1 July 2021, has Tahi missed its date?
Again, I'll take that on notice and check on that.
So how is it possible that Tahi knows what to charge Sydney Trains and others if IPART hasn't yet made a regulated access determination?
I don't believe they've made a determination as yet, but we can check on that.
That's my point, though. How do you know what level of subsidy to provide to Sydney Trains to in turn pay to Tahi if we don't know what the price of access to Tahi's network is?
We use a methodology which is a regulated access pricing methodology. It is based on IPART to determine the access price.
Can I ask you, given that apparently, according to the shareholder agreement, Tahi is set to make $779 million of earnings next year and effectively the same amount of earnings the year after, but Tahi isn't paying taxpayers a single dividend. Why aren't we getting any dividends from this profit-making enterprise? We will only look, so the dividend payments, I believe there will be dividend payments, but that will be clarified when we have Tahi's annual report that will be released later this year. Well, you have the annual report right now, and presumably, have you, by the way, decided this year's shareholder agreement with Tahi?
I need to check on that.
We don't know whether we have a shareholder agreement for the coming year with Tahi. It was meant to be done by 1 July 2021. Like, do we not have one in place?
I can check on that. I would assume it is, but I need to check on that before I come back to you.
Well, was there any change in the dividend policy from Tahi in this year's shareholder agreement?
There is a dividend. So there is a dividend policy. The dividend will. So we have.
I'm reading directly from the shareholder agreement. The last publicly available shareholder agreement shows 0 dividends for the next 3 years. Are we getting 0 dividends for the next 3 years from this profit-making enterprise?
No.
How much dividends are we getting?
I'll have to take that on notice, but they will be clarified when they'll be finalised when the annual report is released later this year.
Sure. Turning to the board, why does a corporation that's managing $40 billion of assets only have 3 independent directors and a board of 4?
That was what the board was set up. They have an opportunity to expand the board if required. That will be determined by the board and the chairman.
Well, Sydney Water manages, I think, a quarter of the assets that Tahi does. Yet it has more board directors. So, given that this is an organisation that is the size of Telstra, are we confident that we have enough directors overseeing it?
Well, this is the first year of operations, so it is in a startup phase. I expect the board will respond as required to its business plan and how it needs to expand its operations.
On that, do we have the 10-year business plan settled?
The business plan is currently being finalised by the board.
And how long are the terms of the independent directors?
I can check on that.
They'll be 2 years. They'll be 3-year terms.
Yeah, and when are they due to expire? Is that 3 years from last July, Mr. Gardner?
Or 3 years from their date of appointment.
How are they selected?
They are selected the same way that the directors of all SOCs are selected.
So does that mean you use a recruitment firm or a advisory firm to help you select candidates?
We can determine whether or not we want to use the recruitment firm. That's one avenue for us to cast our net as wide as possible. But if we have known candidates that either come through recommendation of the business or other stakeholders, then we can run a process in line with government.
Which process did you use for this board, Mr. Gardner?
I personally was not involved in this particular process.
Who was? When this board was appointed last year, who from Treasury is responsible for recruiting directors?
So we have discretion as to who sits on the panel. So, Mr. Mehta, do you want to take that question?
Yes, so there was a panel that had, I was on the panel, included the representations from Transport and from DBC.
So did you use a firm or did you use the known pool or recommendations from Business Method?
We used a firm.
Which firm did you use?
We used Korn Ferry.
Korn Ferry. How much did you pay them?
I have to take that on notice.
How many candidates did they recommend or did they offer you?
Again, I'm going from memory. We can check on that, but from memory, around 7 or 8.
So why then was only 3 selected?
We'll have to come back to this line of questioning. It's crossbench time. Ms. Boyd.
Thank you, Chair. So I guess just carrying on then from Mr. Mookhey's questioning, if presumably there needs to be a level of arm's length transactions between Tahi and other government entities, Sydney Trains, etc., in order to maintain that independence from an accounting perspective. Is there not a risk that this entity that's been established will end up falling foul of those accounting rules despite this kind of level of potential corporatisation and the moves that you've made so far in relation to Tahi?
The model that has been developed accords with the accounting standards. So we are comfortable that the work we have done in this space and the setting up of Tahi meets with the accounting requirement to meet its independence.
Do you think that this level of risk and complexity in the way that government operations have been structured is appropriate for government?
Ms. Boyd, this entity is, as we said earlier, is set up on the basis of a state-owned corporation. It meets, as Mr. Mock said, all the accounting rules. State-owned corporations, I think, have been in New South Wales since about 1989, so this is a well-proven approach. But I might also add it mirrors both Queensland Rail in Queensland, who have a similar structure as a state-owned corporation, and VicTrack in Victoria. So we're actually not the first to do this. It's in place in those other two states as well.
I understand that there is a certain amount of scrambling from my perspective, looking at this, that appears to be that there is a certain amount of scrambling going on from Treasury to make this thing work. Do you regret setting up Tahi in this way?
No, not at all, because it will provide that additional focus that I talked about earlier that you get with the SOC. But bearing in mind, what we're talking about is, you know, to meet the due date, there is still a lot of setup work that had to go on. And a lot of the questions that you and Mr. Mookhey are asking are really questions for the entity and for transport.
Yes, and perhaps we could argue about whether in itself it is appropriate for us to have to ask an independent entity about something as vital as the state's transport network. But let's have let's just turn to another issue of risk and complexity, which is the New Generation Fund. Is it correct that an additional $10 billion in bonds were issued out of TCOP in order to put into the New Generation Fund to then go and invest in other financial assets?
So, Ms. Boyd, I'll answer the first part of that, and I might get Mr. Deverell, the CEO of TCOP, to talk about the debt program. But firstly, legislation prevents the Treasurer from borrowing money to put into the fund. He simply cannot do that. So the answer to that is no. I will get Mr. Deverell to update you, if you wish, on the borrowing program as it stands at the moment.
Thank you. And if you could clarify, because there's been a fair bit of reporting, and I haven't seen it officially denied by the Treasurer, that there has been money borrowed, extra money borrowed this year to go into the New Generation Fund. And
as I said, legislation prevents the Treasurer from doing that.
Okay. Could I have an update then, please, on exactly what is in the New Generation Fund and how it's being sort of what's in there at the moment, and how did it get in there?
Good. I'll get Mr. Deverell to do that. Thank you.
I can talk to the investment strategy of the fund. So the fund is approximately $15 billion of funds under management at the moment. It's managed according to the risk and return characteristics asked for by the government. And what we do is we put a portfolio together that delivers an overall level of return outcome that sits within the risk tolerance that we've been given. The overall allocation of the monies into the various underlying asset classes, I won't go into the complexities of all those now, but it's a level of risk that is less than the typical superannuation fund that you would see that many of us have got our money invested in. And that would be a range of asset classes, equities, both domestic and international, credit, etc.
Could you tell me what, I understand 5% of the fund is invested in opportunistic investments. Can you tell me what they are?
Yeah, so what the fund is trying to do from a construction point of view is to be as highly diversified as possible, because with diversification you get the benefits of being able to deliver on the investment objective, but at a lower level of risk. And so we diversify across geographies, we diversify across asset classes. So, for example, we invest across the world in equities, and that's approximately 40%. Then we invest in asset classes such as credit. Then also what we do is we have an allocation into unlisted equities, which would be unlisted real estate, unlisted infrastructure. And one of the other components of unlisted is what we call unlisted opportunistic. And they are opportunities that get created when you have dislocations in markets. So, for example, last year, when markets were falling very heavily, there was an opportunity for us to invest in various dislocations in some of the markets that we found. That's what we call by the opportunistic section. It doesn't mean high risk and all that sort of stuff. It just means an opportunity presents itself and we can deploy capital quickly.
How much money would the fund lose if there was a significant fall in equity prices, given how high they are historically at the moment?
So what we do is when we look at the construction of the fund, we try to firstly understand the investment return objective, which in this case is CPI plus 4.5. And then we understand the client's risk appetite as to what the tolerance is for losses, because when you invest, you have good years and you have not such good years. The client then determines what that level of risk tolerance is, and then we construct the portfolio. The portfolio can deliver negative returns, but the vast majority of the time will be expected to deliver positive returns. So, for example, in 2020, which was a year of very sharp falls in equity markets, the fund delivered an annual return of negative 0.1%. But since the fund's inception, which was, I think, November 2018, so nearly 3 years ago, the fund has delivered a return just around about 9.5% per annum.
Apologies, Mr. Deverell, I've got limited time. Could I just go back to Mr. Pratt? Thank you for that, Mr. Deverell. Mr. Pratt, when we were talking before about the extra 10 billion, perhaps I didn't phrase that appropriately. So is it the case that that 10 billion was diverted from other revenue sources and then an extra 10 billion was borrowed in order to make up that revenue shortfall? Is that what happened?
Ms. Boyd, you may be referring to the way the fund was seeded. So the fund was set up, as Mr. Deverell indicated, November of 18. It was seeded with 3 billion from balance sheet reserves, and then it was principally seeded with 7 billion from the first tranche of the sale of WestConnex. So that is the 10 billion I suspect you might be thinking about. That was the way the fund was established. And then growth in the fund, as Mr. Deverell has indicated, has come from the performance of the fund. And that's where we are at this present time.
But so things other than asset sale returns are going into the fund now, correct? So is some of the mining royalties going into the fund?
That's correct. That's correct, yes. That is covered by legislation. So mining royalties, some dividends. And the second tranche, if the transaction is successful, of WestConnex also will go into the fund.
And is that amount from mining royalties and other revenue streams discretionary as to whether it goes into the fund or not?
So there is a list of sources of fund that is legislated in the NGF Act. So just to reconcile, the fund is about 15.1 billion in size. 10 billion was seeded. It was a seed money that went in there. Since that time, another 2.4 billion has gone in there from various dividends, and then the rest is a return on the fund of about 2.8 billion. So that's the fund. It is up to the Treasury has the discretion to use different sources of revenue into the fund as long as it's legislated in the Act.
So, okay. So in conclusion, then we have a situation where the Treasurer has chosen to divert some revenue into the fund instead of using it for other things, and we also have extra borrowing through TCOP. Is that correct?
Yeah, at this point in time, Ms. Boyd, that's correct. But I would say that the Treasurer obviously has ongoing options about those issues, and also about whether future fund monies could be used directly for debt clearance, which is the purpose of the fund. So those options are before the Treasurer.
My time has run out. Thank you.
Thanks. So I will call on Mr. Latham, but can I also just take the opportunity, if possible, if witnesses can just state their name before answering a question. I know it's awkward, but it's just for the record of Hansard, if it's possible. Thank you. Mr. Latham.
Thanks, Chair. To Mr. Midhar, in charge of the budget, what were the expenditure cuts in the June budget?
In the 21-22 or
the budget that was delivered in June, yeah, 21-22.
There are no, if you're referring to the, sorry, Sangbin here, if you're referring to efficiency dividend, there are no efficiency dividends that have been put into the budget of 21-22.
In expenditure of over $100 billion, it was impossible to identify any efficiency savings and make spending reductions.
No, there have been savings identified that have been incorporated into the budget. So they are separate to efficiency dividend. So there are savings in procurement that have been put through. There were savings in reduction in some grant expenditure that have also been put through and are incorporated into the budget.
Are they incorporated in the measures statement in budget paper number 1851?
So they're incorporated within agencies, so they would be reflected in the budget result and the budget totals in budget paper 1.
Right. Given that they're a budget measure, why aren't they listed in the measures statement?
So they are incorporated within each agency's expenditure. So it's already built into different agencies' expenditures, but they weren't pulled out as a separate item. Because and each agency has a discretion on exactly which line item within procurement that it can be met. But there is a specific program of that which is a lot more detailed and runs over a few years.
What is the saving in procurement if you were to pull it out?
I can give you that. I can get that for you. I can come back to you on that, Ms. Latham.
Okay, that's one item, and if you could take that on notice, thank you, Mr. Midha. But to answer that point, as to standard budget practice, governments list measures changes on against a no policy change basis in their budget. Why aren't any expenditure reductions? You've identified just one that's in this budget. Why isn't it listed in the measures statement?
So in terms of there were no direct expenditure cuts. They were done through particular projected savings in certain programs. The procurement saving is about $3 billion over 10 years. So that's one of the larger ones. And we've also looked at savings through to move funds into the digital restart, for example. So we have future savings in there, but that's for agencies to find savings to meet government priorities.
Mr. Latham, can we take that on notice? Because I'd like to come back to you on that. There'll be a reason for that. It may not be shown clearly, but that's no intention not to identify savings, as you appreciate.
Okay. Well, Mr. Midha, the measures statement lists 145 items, not points, in the range of cluster portfolios. Is it right that the 145 measures in this budget are all expenditure increases? It's listed.
Again, I'll take that on notice. I haven't checked those 145 statements, but I suspect they were all increases.
Okay. And so it's apparently not Treasury practice to list expenditure savings in the measures statement, and they're buried somewhere in the portfolio data. Why isn't it Treasury practice to list the actual amount of the expenditure increase for each of these 145 dot points?
I don't have an explanation for that. Each measure should have an amount on it. I don't have it in front of me, but I can check on that.
Okay. Given the paucity of any attempt to make expenditure savings in this budget, Mr. Midha, what is the process in your section of the Treasury by which you try to identify expenditure savings and they go up to the ERC?
So we do work with each agency to look for efficiency savings across their portfolio. We work closely on a number of different methods. So the first one is to look at opportunities to on the outcomes, on the processes around outcomes. So we look for programs and look for the delivery of metrics against outcomes. So we do work with them they come up with, each agency is responsible for coming up with opportunities to reduce their, or to improve their efficiency. And we work with them collaboratively, and we provide opportunities for savings as part of our, I guess, our fiscal examination of the state of accounts.
How many agencies bring forward savings to the ERC?
I don't have that in hand. In this budget process, agencies did bring forward savings to offset particular policies, but I don't have that in hand.
Mr. Latham, I might just mention also, we can get you detail on this if you wish, but there are significant procurement savings in this budget over the period of the next decade, including the budget period and beyond that. The government also had a wages policy of 30 basis points. As you know, they recently changed that to 2.5%. But there was, because the base was lower, there was significant savings in this budget on wages as well. And the efficiency dividend, whilst Mr. Might is correct, there was no new efficiency dividend, but the 3% that we had in place is still continuing through. So we can sum those numbers for you and get them if you wish, but there are significant savings in the budget.
Would I be right in saying that no minister brought forward savings of their own to the ERC?
That's not correct. There were savings were brought forward.
Okay. What we've identified through, you're saying the ED carries on. I suppose that's true. The wage pause was temporary, but had some lingering longer term impact, and you've said procurement. Do you find as a Treasury there's an imbalance between a budget with over $102 billion of spending, that there were 3 cost savings, and one of those is not actually new, and 145 expenditure increases, indicating a government that's lost all fiscal discipline?
So there are 2 types of savings. So we've mentioned the 3 ones that as Treasury we support and oversight. For example, as Mr. Pratt mentioned, the 0.3 pay increase for a year saved us in 3.1 billion over 5 years. So that's obviously impacted the budget. And there were through the budget process, agencies have provided approximately I will need to check, but about $1 billion worth of offsets for new proposals. So there were offsets provided to offset the 145 measures that were in the measure statement.
But they're not counted as measures. On notice, can we get a list of the measures that you're now talking about that weren't actually listed in the appropriate part of the budget papers?
So that was provided to as part of the cabinet process. So that hasn't been made public through the budget papers.
So there are significant budget measures that don't actually get published in the budget.
No, that's not correct. But Mr. Latham, can we take this on?
Budget said.
No,
You just said that those measures were provided in the cabinet process and not published in the budget papers. What sort of fiasco is this?
Well, I think Mr. Minter is referring to ERC discussions about optionality on cost saves. That is a discussion ongoing, as you'd expect. But what I will take on notice for you is to give you a breakdown of the cost saves in this budget.
Okay, you can please give an extensive explanation as to why in the measures section of a budget, federal and state, there's always expenditure increases and decreases listed. Why this is not the practice in New South Wales, which just seems absolutely extraordinary. We'll check the Hansard of what Mr. Midhar said earlier, but he did say just moments ago that the items go to the cabinet, but they're not published in the budget.
Well, if they're approved and they're carried through, they will be in the budget.
Okay, well,
So
we can get some clarification of what's gone on. You've mentioned you've mentioned 2 new measures, one of them modified. They don't appear. Oh, the wages one does in the appear in the 145, but not the procurement. But if we can get some clarification to what's gone on, because it looks like a very poor budget transparency process. Could I further ask Mr. Midhar, is the government complying with its own Fiscal Responsibility Act?
Sorry, there was a bit of overtalk on that. I missed the question. Sorry.
Yeah, point of order, Madam Chair.
Yes, Mr. Franklin. I'm just letting people wrap up. So it's final question, final answer, and then it's time for the break.
So can I just clarify the procurement savings? There is a section in the measure statement for all cluster savings reform and offset measures, which are included. which include the procurement savings.
Mr. Midhar, my final question was, is the government complying with its own Fiscal Responsibility Act in the last two budgets?
So the expenditure, our rate of growth of expenditure because of the stimulus measures has exceeded the stated long-term revenue measure of 5.6. So from that perspective, that is, but yes, so that measure has been exceeded.
Okay, so
So,
thanks everybody. This is now, we will now take a 15-minute break. Can I just remind everyone to mute and turn your cameras off because the broadcast will continue, but we will return to this at 11:15. Okay, are we ready to start? Great, welcome back, everybody. The opposition.
Chair, I had a couple of points of clarification for follow-up. Did you want me to mention that first before we?
Yes, sure, Mr. Pratt.
There were two things. There was a question, I think, from Mr. Mookhey on JobSaver take-up. I can give you the first fortnight, Mr. Mookhey, which was 378 million. And I'm endeavouring to get the other numbers for you, but that's the grant program, the first fortnight. And there was a question, again, from Mr. Mookhey on the remuneration of the CEO of Tahi. That issue is being dealt rightly by the Transport Minister, not by the Treasurer. So he is writing back to you, Mr. Mookhey, on that issue.
And can I clarify too?
Sorry, and the measure statement was the third one.
Yeah, thank you. So I just want to clarify Mr. Latham's question on the measure statement. The measure statement, I have confirmed that it does contain all measures with a materiality threshold of over 20 million. So any items not in there are those below 20 million, but it does contain all measures, including all savings. And the other one, I do want to confirm that the government does comply with the Fiscal Responsibility Act. And there is on Section E, in Appendix E in Budget Paper 1, it details the government's statement on actions taken against the FRA to comply with the Act.
Okay, thank you for those points of clarification. We'll start the questioning now from the opposition.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Treasury Secretary, for those clarifications. Just on the particular clarification about Tahi CEO's remuneration, Treasurer under the State-Owned Corporations Act has the power and is in many senses required to provide his concurrence or his approval to the remuneration, which he did this year after receiving a briefing from the Treasury. So to the extent to which you say that it's a matter for transport, how can it be a matter for transport given the Act says that the Treasurer has to give concurrence? And equally, the Treasurer did give his concurrence.
Yes, I'll get Mr. Gardner to comment, Mr. Mookhey, on the detail, but as I understand it, the Treasurer gives his concurrence to a remuneration range. Then the actual dollar amount is set within that range by the Board of Tahi in conjunction, as I understand it, with the Transport Minister. But Mr. Gardner,
I appreciate that, Mr. Pratt. Yeah. That does actually clarify it. But therefore, what was the range that the Treasurer gave his concurrence to for the CEO of Tahi?
So that will be declared in the annual report for Tahi in the normal way we require SOCs to declare their executive remuneration. Sorry, it's
I know. And look, I look forward to reading it in the annual report in December, but I'm asking you now at a budget estimates hearing, can you tell us what it is so we don't have to wait 6 months?
I'll take that on notice.
Okay. Turning to the board issues of Tahi, Mr. Miller, through you, of course, with your permission, Mr. Pratt, did the panel consider appointing Mr. Mike Murdoch to the Tahi board?
From memory, yes.
Mr. Murdoch is the former Secretary of the Commonwealth Transport Department, that's correct?
I believe so.
And did the panel recommend that he be appointed as chair?
I'd have to take that on. I don't believe so, no.
Did the Treasurer overturn the panel's recommendation as to who to appoint to the board?
Sorry, can you repeat that again, please?
Did the Treasurer overturn advice from the panel about who to appoint to the board of Tahi?
No, I think all our board recommendations were accepted.
Right. So, therefore, if the panel and the Treasury recommended the existing board directors, why did Treasury recommend 3 board directors, none of whom have rail experience, and 2 of whom are the chair and a member of Sydney Water, and the other is a director of Water New South Wales?
The panel made the selection. There was a criteria that we went through, and I'd have to take that on notice to go. That was a while ago.
given the very serious safety obligations that Tahi has under national rail law, was it a requirement for board directors to have knowledge of those rail laws and experience with rail transport businesses?
So I'd like to clarify that the safety responsibility lies with the operators and with transport. It is regulated, it is a national regulation. Tahi ensures that its operators have complied with those regulations, and it provides an additional layer that wasn't there before Tahi on terms of safety checks. The license of the operators are dependent on meeting that.
Yes, look, that's helpful context. But my actual question was, are board of directors of Tahi required to have experience in rail safety laws and rail safety?
I can check, but I don't believe that was one of the criteria in the selection of the board. I do believe one of the board directors, Mr. Trevor Bourne, came with some experience in safety in the transport. This is from memory. I'd have to go back and check, but I believe that was the case.
He has experience in air transport, not rail transport, you'll find. And they are very different laws with their different frameworks. Mr. Pratt, is it a risk to not have board directors who have safety experience for Tahi?
Well, I can't really comment, Mookhey. I wasn't involved in the process, Mr. Mookhey, on the selection of the board. But you'd expect that they had the right experience and skill base to be appointed to this board. Other than that, I can't comment specifically.
Okay. Mr. Pratt, I'm going to move on then. Did Treasury hire Ms. Heather Watson of KPMG to prepare a report on Tahi?
Yes, we did.
And when was that Ms. Watson engaged?
I'll check with Mr. Minor, but I think from memory it would have been late 19, early 2020, I would have thought. Is that correct?
Yeah, so we started in February 19 to look at accounting standards, and then so that work was happening in parallel, and then in 20, Ms. Watson was hired to specifically look at Tahi in more detail.
Sure. Mr. Pratt, did you improve the engagement of Ms. Watson?
I'd have to check on that, Mr. Mookhey.
How much has Ms. Watson's engagement cost?
I'll see if we have that available, Mr. Minor.
I don't have that number to hand. We can take it on
I'm quite happy to take it on notice, Mr. Mookhey, and come back to you.
Thank you, Mr. Pratt. I'd appreciate that. How was Ms. Watson selected?
Sorry, I can't miss that one.
How was she selected?
Well, how was Ms. Watson selected?
So, so there are, again, engagement. She's a selected partner because of her technical finance and accounting experience, also being an ex-auditor with the Auditor General's Office. We have good, so we have used Ms. Watson extensively in Treasury for accounting advice, and therefore it was when we were looking for specific accounting advice for Tahi, Ms. Watson was asked to continue her work in that space.
So she was handpicked.
Sorry, you're talking out of there.
Was she handpicked?
Yes.
And that did not go to tender, did it?
So no, that was the only that was the best accounting experience that from the work that Ms. Watson had been doing with Treasury. We were comfortable that we had the right experience to guide us through setting up the Tahi SOC.
Has a contract award notice been published about Ms. Watson's engagement?
I'll have to take that on notice.
I can't find any. I checked. Was it above the threshold for disclosure?
It could be part of an overarching accounting advice provision as part of the work that we do on the total state sector accounts, and this might have been a subset as part of that.
Well, on notice, can you identify how this has been publicly reported in any form?
I'll take that on notice.
Thank you. How much has Treasury spent on total on consultants regarding Tahi?
Again, we'll have to take that on notice.
Then, Mr. Dominda, do you mind on notice that just getting us a breakdown by amount by firm?
Sure, yes.
Thank you. Across Treasury in total, how much has Treasury spent on consulting with the big four accounting firms, Deloitte, EY, KPMG, PwC, in the last year, across all projects?
Take that on notice, thank you.
Thank you. And can you tell us how many engagements are of either of those four firms is below the $150,000 disclosure threshold?
You will take that on notice.
Yeah, on notice, can we get a list of all projects and descriptions that are less than $150,000 and what the purpose of the engagement was?
I'll take that on notice.
Thank you. Does Treasury have any firm or consultant on a monthly retainer?
Again, I don't believe so, but I'll take that on notice.
Thank you. Mr. Pratt, just a few more questions about this. Have you had any meetings with the current Transport Secretary about Tahi?
Not that I can recall directly. It's been probably mentioned in a few conversations, Mr. Mookhey, but a specific meeting, not that I can recall, no.
Sure. And have you had an exchange of correspondence of any form with the existing Transport Secretary?
Again, I can't recall, but I'm happy to look at that and come back to you. I'll take on notice if that's okay.
Thank you, Mr. Pratt. I appreciate that. In your incidental discussions with the Transport Secretary, what was discussed?
There was nothing of strong recollection other than the process that we've been going through to get this established, so nothing further than that.
Okay. Were you in dispute with the previous Transport Secretary about Tahi?
I wouldn't say dispute. I mean, certainly we had rigorous debate about the setup of Tahi and the position going forward, as you'd hope that we would. Sorry, can I just add to that?
Yeah, please. Sorry, Mr. Pratt. I thought you had still a...
No, that's all right. No. But this was, as you know, legislated in 2017. It was a requirement of Transport and Treasury to work together on this. And so there was a joint responsibility between both secretaries to make sure this was implemented. And the Transport Secretary at the time, Mr. Stokes, was well aware of that and working towards it.
Did Mr. Staples ever tell you that the formation of Tahi poses a risk to the budget or a risk to rail safety?
Can I just clarify that the Tahi is not an operator, it's not the safety accredited party?
Sure, I appreciate the context, Mr. Mayor, but the question is to the Secretary. Did the previous Secretary of Transport ever tell you that the formation of Tahi poses a risk to the budget or a risk to rail safety?
He raised safety as being a key issue, Mr. Mookhey, and Mr. Staples had every right to do that. So they were charged, as in Transport, through Mr. Staples, were charged with addressing safety and operations as part of the Tahi implementation. And we were addressed, as you'd expect, to look at the fiscal modelling work. Now, when all this went through and was approved in late 20, safety and operations was ticked off by Transport as part of that approval process.
Okay, thank you. Did you meet with the Secretary of the Department of Premier and Cabinet last year with Mr. Staples to discuss Tahi?
Yes, I can recall the three of us meeting on it, yes.
And was that in large part designed to resolve your respective views?
That was really to come together and say, where are we at and how's it progressing? Yes, so that was the purpose of the meeting.
Okay. Have you spoken to the Premier directly about Tahi?
No. I mean, other than, sorry, let me qualify that, Mr. Mookhey, other than ERC discussions, which are part of the ongoing process, no.
Sure. Look, my final question about Tahi, Mr. Pratt, is Tahi a sham?
Absolutely not, Mr. Mookhey, and I've given you other examples of both to the north in Rail and Vic Track in Victoria, very similar structures. But as you'd understand, I mean, I'm quite offended by those accusations that are being made, because Treasury has a rigorous process of assessment and approval internally. We have a second line of defence, if you like, which is what I call as the assurance process. We have deputy secretaries who engage, and then it finally gets to me before it gets anywhere near the Treasurer. And I just want to assure you and members that that process holds up on all policy, not just A.
Thank you, Mr. Pratt. Can I just now turn to the New South Wales Generation Fund? I think, and to pick up the line of questioning asked by my colleague, Ms. Boyd, can we just get the exact current size of the debt retirement fund in the New South Wales Generation Fund?
15
Mr. Mitre is talking. Yes, go on, Mr. Mitre.
It's approximately 15.1 billion.
15.1. And how much is in the community fund?
There is at the moment there is nothing in the community fund. That has been discontinued. This was discontinued last year when we were looking at making expense savings to fund the stimulus costs that were rising in 2020.
Okay, so just to be clear, the government abolished the community fund that was meant to distribute to community groups half of the investments returned earned from the first half of the sale of WestConnex, just to be clear.
Yeah, that fund is not in operation. It's not utilised anymore. There was about 25 million. I'll have to check again on notice to find out how much was in there.
I think it was 28, but yes, I take your point. In the last annual report about the NGF, its balance was 11,279,000,000. So it's increased by approximately 4 billion in the intervening period. I'd just like to know, what was the government contribution to the DRF in the Debt Retirement Fund in financial year ending 30 June 2021?
It was about 2 billion.
2 billion. So there was a $2 billion inflow from the government into the NGF last year. Is that fair?
In 2021, yeah. That's right.
So at the same time last year, the government was adding $2.1 billion to the fund. We had an operating deficit of $7.8 billion, didn't we?
That was the budget result. We have, so what we look at is the cash surplus. So we have been in cash surplus, and over the next 4 years, we are in cash surplus. So it is not a cash deficit. So we are, so the money came from some dividends and excess previous contribution.
So Mr. Midard, just on that point about cash surplus, I'm reading from budget paper this year, budget statement A19, General Government Sector Cash Flow Statement. It shows that there's a cash deficit last year of 17.3 billion. A cash deficit was revised down to 16.8 billion. It projects a cash deficit this coming year of 18.6 billion, and cash deficits every year over the forward estimates. So when you say that we are putting this money in as effectively as a result of a cash surplus, how is that possible, given the budget papers themselves show that we're running massive cash deficits for the next 4 years?
Right. So we look at when we say cash surplus, we look at as per our operating. So that's I think that's. Let me just clarify the line. I'm not sure that's the correct line, but I'll just bring that up. And just
whilst you're looking it up, it's on page A19. It's the last result, so it's the last line. But on that point, though, but in effect, the choice to put $2 billion into the NGF, the same time that we had an operating deficit of 7.8 billion, means we have indirectly increased borrowing, haven't we?
So we have the line is the. I'm just trying to look at the cash operating line. Is the one that. So if you look at, it's a net cash flows from operating activities. That's our cash position. So in 1920.
But I see that line. But effectively, the choice to not use that cash surplus to reduce the budget, to reduce debt, has resulted in increased borrowing, isn't it? Because there's two choices about what to do with the cash surplus. You either use it to reduce your appropriations the following year, or you put it into a fund. Basically, the government made a policy choice to put the cash surplus into the fund, despite running a large operating deficit. That's true?
So yes, so the fund has a growth trajectory. So and this is in line with that growth trajectory to try and grow the fund. It is in its infancy at the moment within the first 3 years. So putting money into the fund was always envisaged.
Yes, and that's a policy choice of government to divert the cash surplus into the NGF despite running an operating deficit, correct?
So, like I said, it was a budget deficit, but from a cash perspective, we're in cash surplus. So, but I take your point.
Yes. Oh, thank you. Because it took me a while to figure it all out. But thank you. Can I just ask you then on the NGF, what is the gross borrowings for New South Wales now in the coming year? I saw the announcement from TCorp on budget day that it was $35 billion. But there's speculation in the bond market that it's now $50 billion. So how much will we be borrowing this year?
So, again, the borrowings will depend upon the needs. So we announced a much larger borrowing program last year. We borrowed a lot less. So we look at projections. So last year we borrowed probably about $5 or $6 billion less than we were expecting to. Some of those activities moved into this year, particularly our stimulus payments are continuing into this year. So we have large stimulus payments, a lot of capital programs, particularly the infrastructure funds that we haven't set up. So a lot of those amount to about $4 or $5 billion. So that was added on to this year's. So in total this year's, when I compared to last year, the actual like for like, if you look at this.
No. My question was, I've only got a minute left before I pass. Really straightforward question. I saw the press release announced from TCorp on the 22nd or 23rd of June that said that the borrowing task for New South Wales is $35 billion. I have two questions. Is it still $35 billion or has it increased? And has it increased to $50 billion, which is what we have major banks telling us that's how much New South Wales will be borrowing this year?
Yeah, Mr. Mookhey, let me clarify. It is 35.5 billion at this point. It's important to note that 4.4 billion of that number is maturities this year. So the net number is 31.1. We will revise this over the next month to 2 months, and certainly we'll be publishing in the half year an update. But obviously circumstances have changed, even since the budget, as you'd appreciate. So we'll work through this.
It's not a criticism. It really is not, because of obvious reasons why New South Wales would need to borrow more. But what I'm trying to appreciate is what is the size of the task. And I think you've done a good job of answering it and telling me it's likely to be revised upwards. But can I just ask you to respond to this? The CBA this morning has alerted the fact that New South Wales right now has the most expensive debt of any state government. Our spread compared to the Commonwealth rate is at its highest in history. Is it the case that the choice to increase the NGF has effectively increased the cost of our debt?
I doubt that's the case, but I'll get Mr. Deverell to comment in a moment if I could, because he's close to markets on a daily basis. But what I would say, Mr. Mookhey, is the government will have choices to make, given where we're at and the issues that you've raised. What should the optimal size of the fund be? When should the government look at some debt clearance and not borrow against this number, more fully? So these are issues that we will be looking at over the next few months. Mr. Deverell, do you want to comment? I'm sorry?
Yes, you can.
I think my time's expired.
It has. Mr. Deverell, we'll let you finish the answer though, and then it's crossbench time.
You're on mute, David, I think.
Sorry, I'm new to this. Apologies. Yes, so David Deverell. So the cost of borrowings for New South Wales TCorp are they move up and down, as you can imagine, with market movements. The cost of 10-year debt at the moment for New South Wales is about 1.47% per annum, which is lower than what it was a couple of months ago. So that's the absolute level. The point that you're making, Mr. Mookhey, is the spread relative to the Commonwealth and relative to other relative to other semis. So the spread relative to Commonwealth in the last 2 years has traded in a range of between about 20 basis points, which is 0.2%, up to about 70 basis points, which is about 0.7%. So that's higher than the Commonwealth. Currently, it's around about that midpoint. So it's traded in a range and it's current in that midpoint. Then you've got the spread difference between ourselves and the other semi-governments, and we closely track one another. Sometimes one state is higher or lower than the other. At the moment, the cost of New South Wales debt, or the spread for New South Wales debt, is slightly higher than some of the other semis. For example, it's about 5 basis points, which is 0.05% higher than Victoria.
Thank you. Ms. Boyd?
Thank you. I will turn to Mr. Archistra in just a minute, but I just wanted to ask one last question of you, Mr. Pratt, just in relation to the rating agencies. How much does the New South Wales Treasury pay each of Moody's and S&P each year?
Have we got that?
Not handy. I can try and get that to you, but
all right, we'll have to take it on notice, I think. Ms. Boyd, I'm sorry.
Thank you.
It's Mr. Gardner here, Ms. Boyd. The only comment, I can't give you the absolute numbers, so I'll take that on notice, but the only thing that I would reference is that payment is linked to the size of our debt program. So as our debt program grows, that profile, so it's not a fixed number.
Yeah, I would expect that. Okay, that would be great if you could give me the information for the last at least 5 years on how much you've spent on both those agencies. That would be fantastic.
We'll do that. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Archistra, thank you so much for making time to be with us today. I just wanted to ask you a little bit about the recommendation you made in relation to a road user charge in the Productivity Commission white paper, or Productivity white paper, sorry. I just wanted to ask you whether, so when we look at, there's a statement that you make in there about replacing stamp duty on vehicles with a road user charge is a little bit similar to replacing stamp duty on houses with the land tax. And I absolutely agree that stamp duty is an inefficient tax, but it is at least progressive, being based on the value of the asset. I would put to you that replacing stamp duty on a vehicle with a road user charge is a little bit like charging, replacing stamp duty on a house and charging someone for the amount of time they spend in their house, as opposed to it being, a real analogy. Did you consider replacing stamp duty on vehicles with an annual tax based on the value of the car, rather than heading down this road user charge route?
Peter Archistra speaking. Thank you very much, Ms. Boyd, for that. Ms. Boyd, for that question. We've got two separate recommendations in relation to road user charges. One is, and not related to this, I'll get to your one in a second, Ms. Boyd. The first one is in relation to, we believe you can't necessarily build your way out of congestion, and so we're suggesting that Transport for New South Wales implement a range of processes to encourage a smoother usage of roads throughout the period of the day with the existing ones. And if that does not work within 3 years, then they'd be looking at implementing some form of cordon charging. So I'll leave that to one side. Now, the recommendation you're talking about is in relation to for certain electronic type vehicles, electric vehicles, abolishing the stamp duty and replacing it with a per kilometre charge. We recommended an amount. I think the government has taken up something slightly different, but in the same spirit. Now, your specific question is a lump sum being replaced by a usage one. What our view is, from a productivity point of view, is that the usage is what should be taxed, rather than necessarily the fact that you've got the car. So the people who use the roads more should actually pay a user charge higher than the people who have got a car that don't use it and wear it out. And that's why we're suggesting the road user charge.
And was there consideration given to the options that different people have? For instance, people who don't live near public transport or don't have very good public transport options obviously need to drive more than others. Was there consideration given to the impact on economic inequality from the proposal?
Look, a very good point. At the moment, with the excise tax on petrol and diesel, people do pay more when they live further away. And so the purpose of the road user charge that we're recommending is similar. It's probably slightly less. I think on average, the per kilometre one for an excise is, I think, about is considerably higher than the 1.5 or the 6 cents we're recommending. So if your question is people who don't live near public transport, who have to rely on a motor vehicle, at the moment, if they're relying on a motor vehicle, the petrol that they use has an excise on it, and the more kilometres they travel, the more excise duty they will pay. So it's consistent with what we're saying in relation to the road user charge.
Okay, but obviously when you're paying for fuel, it's, you know, you can try and reduce by being more efficient as to how much fuel you use. What if you are someone who lives in a place without public transport and you choose an electric vehicle, which, as we know, are coming down in price now to approximate ICE vehicles, you choose to have an electric vehicle and you choose to charge it, say, with solar panels. That person will then receive no benefit for having gone about their purchase decisions in a efficient way. How does that fit in with the logic of introducing a road user charge?
Well, that's a really good point. I'll have to sort of unpack that a little bit. So if at the moment, if you're using a car, you can choose to use a more efficient fuel car. So instead of a big V8, you use a little 4-cylinder, so you pay less excise tax. So you can make that strategic decision. If in relation to the electric car, instead of using one which draws power from the grid, which is generated somewhere else, you choose to generate it yourself. Why should, well, someone's still got to pay for the road, I would imagine.
It's a little bit,
you've still got to pay for the road.
I think we could talk for some length about the lack of some of those logical connections that are being made in relation to road user charge.
Look, it's a very good point you make.
Thank you. I note that you do say that eventually taking the per kilometre charge up to 6 cents
correct,
would make sense. When I'm looking at a new electric vehicle, say, I think there's a new, is it the new MG that's like 44,000? I'd be looking
coming down in price.
Yeah, I'd be looking at initial stamp duty charge of about $1,400, I understand. If we had a 6 cent per kilometre charge, I'd be paying about $1,000 in road user charge every year, which would pretty much negate the savings from no longer having to pay stamp duty. Do you think that really is an incentive for people to have uptake of EVs?
Yeah, Peter Actistrad here. In relation to the user charge, it's got two functions. One would be to counteract the reduction in the stamp duty that there's been the concession, but also there's a necessity to pay for the roads. There's a necessity to have a substitute for the excise that is collected through petrol. So one day, when we all get to electric cars and there's no excise duty coming from petrol and gasoline, someone's going to have to pay for the roads. Now,
but you know as well as I do, apologies for interrupting, you know as well as I do that federal excise tax just goes into general revenue and is only notionally there for paying for roads. And some people would argue that perhaps their tax is what should pay for the roads that are an essential part of society. I think I will leave it there because I'm almost out of time. I will just ask though, thank you though, Mr. Actistrad. Mr. Pratt, if I could just ask you very quickly, the modelling for the EV tax, did you take into account this sort of increase in pricing from the 2.5 cents per kilometre when working out whether or not it would be revenue neutral and at what point? Was it taken into account in the modelling?
There was extensive modelling done on this policy, as you expect, Ms. Boyd. Ms. Wilkie led that work. I might get her to talk to the modelling specifically, if that's all right with you.
Thank you.
Joanne Wilkie here. Yes, Ms. Boyd, we did look at a range of different price points. That work is still really under cover of Cabinet in confidence, so we'll have to take advice from the Treasurer before, and I'll have to take that on notice in terms of what we might be able to tell you about that modelling.
Thank you. And also whether it's considered that you would also increase that 2.5 cents rate for time of day charging, congestion charging, and other types of increases as we've seen in other jurisdictions.
Yeah, we can take that into account. I would note, though, that given that the road user charge at this point, per the proposal in front of Parliament, is not for that to begin until 2027, and whether it would increase at a future time is really a matter for a future government.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Latham? Sorry, Mr. Latham, I think you're muted.
Thank you. Is that better?
Yes.
Okay, thanks, Chair. And if I could come back to Mr. Moriarty with the points of clarification that he made just prior to the morning tea break. He mentioned a change in position as to his assessment of whether the Fiscal Responsibility Act was being breached, and referred the committee to the budget paper number 1, E3, the statement on performance and reporting under the Fiscal Responsibility Act. Mr. Moriarty, doesn't it say under the fiscal target of annual expense growth, get below the long-term average revenue growth, that's 5.6%, and it states here, the budget forecast 2021 and 21-22 expense growth to exceed the long-term revenue growth rate. So there is a breach there, isn't there, for these 2 years of the current budget and the immediate past one?
So, Mr. Mehta here, so there's 2 parts to that. So one is those metrics, as you were mentioned, are more than the long-term savings growth, revenue growth of 5.6%. However, the Act asks the government to state its remediation to stay within the Act. So it has met that test.
So there's a 2-year, 2-budget breach, but the Treasury takes no action about that because of the promise to do better in the future. Is that how it works?
So that's what the Act requires, and the government has complied with the Act.
Okay, does Treasury ever produce an underlying structural position for the New South Wales budget that would give us a better handle on whether this clause in the Act is being complied with?
I don't understand the question. What do you mean by underlying structure? Sorry.
Well, they do it in the federal budget. They've always done it to look at to factor out variations in annual expenditure increases, revenue changes, to look at the longer term structural position of the state budget, but you don't make that analysis.
No, we don't. We don't have a similar standard.
It's all on the bottom line. It's all on the bottom line. And I suppose you apply the same reasoning to the legislated requirement to align general government revenue and expense growth, page E4, where there's a 2-year breach by this government, but a promise to do better in the future. So it's the same rationale, is it?
That's right.
How many budget breaches do you need over a period of time before you decide that the Fiscal Responsibility Act has in fact been breached in substance?
So the Fiscal Responsibility Act allows the government to have remedial action, to take remedial action. So that is currently being done by the government, and the government is still committed to the AAA rating, and actions are being taken to get the government back on track to the AAA rating.
Mr. Latham, I just mentioned though that in respect to the expense issue, these have obviously been, really challenging times with putting money in to support COVID across government. So most unusual times for all of us, and therefore that's led to those expense breaches, as you're well aware, but for very good reasons.
Yeah. But I've been looking for the extraordinary time clause in the Fiscal Responsibility Act and I can't find it. So it's a legislated law in New South Wales and you'd expect compliance with it. I'm just asking, we've had 2 years of breaches. Is it 3, 4, 5, 6 years where it's determined that the Act has been breached in substance?
Well, the government has committed, as Mr. Might has mentioned, to look at complying with these requirements. That's the intent. We are working to try and do that, but at the moment, the expense issue is a very challenging one.
Okay, and what of the downgrade by S&P Global of our triple credit rating to AA+? Is that a problem in terms of the Fiscal Responsibility Act, that the objective of the Act is not being met with that major credit agency?
So we do meet, so we are still AAA with Moody's, and as I said earlier, the action has been taken to get back on track with AAA, with S&P. Also, it's not a breach of the Act because these are targets. So as I've said, so the Act is not breached. So the actions taken are remedial actions as the government has complied with.
Okay, so the Act is really a guideline to the government. It's of no legal substance or consequence in the current circumstances. Is that how Treasury reads it?
Well, the Act is meant to assist the government in achieving the AAA rating as its target, and the pathway has been stated here in our way to achieve that. So,
Mr. Latham, can I just say I wouldn't want you to take away from this discussion that we're not focused on this. We are, and the issue around expense management gets a lot of ongoing focus. And as I said, at the extraordinary point we find ourselves, a significant amount of this breach is related to COVID spend. But we're also, as far as I'm aware, the government is very committed around AAA. And as you know, we've kept one AAA with Moody's. As far as I'm aware, the government is committed to getting the other AAA standing back from S&Ps.
Sure, thanks, Mr. Pratt. Yes, there is COVID expenditure, but from what I can see in the budget, next to no attempt to offset that with any form of substantial structural saving in the budget. So can I come to the second point of Mr. Maidar's clarifications, and that is, where in the 145 measures in the measures statement does it mention procurement?
I'll have to take that on notice, but the procurements are efficiency savings that are built into agencies' baseline expense. So that has been ongoing to a number of different projects, and each agency meets their cost savings in procurement in their own budget.
Okay, but you did say at the morning tea break that all the expenditures and savings are listed in the measures statement. In the whole of government, where you'd expect procurement to be, given you've just said it's a whole of government measure, there are 7 dot points, and none of them mention procurement. So it doesn't feature. Can you get some clarification on notice, Mr. Midhar, as to what's gone on there, given you've given me 3 different versions now of what this measure statement is supposed to be doing? And it does mention the revised wages policy, which against the no policy change basis for the current budget is actually an expenditure increase. So in 145 items, there's no attempt to bring the budget into any sort of fiscal responsibility. Can I put to you, Mr. Pratt, that because of this absence of any form of fiscal restraint and the drying up of the pots of gold of privatisation for this government, it's forced you into funny money schemes and accounting tricks like Tahi and playing the stock market for the Generations Fund? Isn't that the bottom line of this abysmal state of fiscal management in New South Wales?
Well, Mr. Latham, sadly they are sensationalist type comments. I mean, I reject all those comments that you've just made. That is not the case. I'm more than happy for Mr. Gardner, who's leading the procurement work, if you wish, to give you an outline now of those cost saves. They're significant. We will come back to you and outline this in detail if you'd like me to take that on notice. I'm very happy to do that. But as I've indicated earlier, this is not about facades and tricks and other things. All the work we're doing has strong accounting standards around it. We are focused on fiscal repair, and I've outlined some of the bigger items to you already, but it is a very strong focus through Treasury around cost management, and I'll come back to you on that detail if you'd like me to.
Can I just
What fiscal? Thank you. Thank you very much. Which fiscal repair items are you working on now for the next budget?
Well, procurement is ongoing because that's a huge spend across government, as you appreciate. So there is further opportunity in procurement. Secondly, we are doing a major review of clusters, which we've just started recently. And the intent of that is to look at operating efficiencies. How can we better operate across government within clusters of government? And there will always be efficiencies in that area, given the scale of government that you've mentioned. There will always be cost saves. So that is work that we've got underway. And of course, the wages saving is still significant, despite the recent policy decision. Because we lowered the baseline, there's significant savings over the forwards on wages as well.
Just in terms of your work in reviewing portfolios, could I take you to budget paper number 2, the outcome statement? And this is supposed to be a reflection of the introduction of outcome-based budgeting. Where is there any mention of serious policy review in many, many areas of failure? Isn't this document just simply a list of spending commitments and some propaganda statements about the government finding this to be challenging times? What is in outcome statement, budget paper number 2, of any use to anyone in thinking that what you've just said about ongoing review and fiscal responsibility is in any measure true?
Well, the outcome statement is really making, in fact, more information available on what the outcomes are of each key part of government around clusters. And that is desired to start for the first time being much more transparent about those spends. Now, it's still, in early days as such, but there is a strong intent to do what I think you're asking for, and that is to be much more transparent about that.
Okay, so the time for this portion has expired. We're back to the opposition.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Pratt, or to however you wish to direct, what is the government contribution to the Generations Fund for the coming year?
I'll see if we have that available, Mr. Mookhey.
I don't have that number at hand. Or what? So if you give me a minute, I'll bring that up.
We'll try and get that.
Look, if you could.
Yeah.
I'll ask you the next question. Yes. The next question is the government policy intention still to deposit the proceeds of the WestConnex privatisation into the NGF?
Yes, that is legislated that the second tranche will go into the NGF. That's correct.
Given the government has said in multiple instances that the products of privatisation will be used to build infrastructure, why then is the government depositing this into the debt retirement fund, which can't be used to build infrastructure?
Well, the issue around the NGF, the intent around the NGF is for future debt retirement across generations. Separate to that is the borrowing program, which is really principally around infrastructure, the $108 billion program. Now, having said that, the government has choices, Mr. Mookhey, and when you look at the transaction, second tranche of this transaction, it will go into the NGF by legislation. But I'll be looking at this in terms of recommendations to government about whether it retains all of that in the fund, given these unique circumstances. Because when we put the budget together, this was not foreseen, as you'd appreciate. So what we're now seeing with spend, it will be time to reflect on what is the optimal size of the fund, should government actually retire some debt earlier or not, and these are things that I'll be looking at.
I appreciate that, Mr. Pratt. Can I just ask, on the WestConnex privatisation, I see in the government's announcement of the sale process that we are making a capital commitment fee to bidders, which means we're effectively paying for everyone to bid. How much are we paying the bidders for WestConnex?
I'll get Mr. Gardner to comment on that, Mr. Moore.
Look, I can't make any comments specifically on the WestConnex transaction now.
Well, sure. Well, I mean, is it the case that we are paying bidders 1% of their enterprise value?
1% of their enterprise value?
Yeah.
I mean, there are criteria that need to be met in order for that payment to be made, and one of them is that we have achieved a successful transaction. And so it's only it's a net outcome. It's not a specific payment the government is committed to.
Sure. Is it the case that we are having to pay people to bid for WestConnex because we have anti-competitive clauses that favoured the incumbents in the first sale process?
I'm not aware of any anti-competitive clauses you're referring to, Mr. Mookhey.
I'm referring to the grant of a right of first bid.
That does not provide the incumbent with any specific advantage against someone who wants to bid in this sale process.
Has any bidder expressed to you a concern that the granting of a first right offer to the incumbent consortium means that they are unlikely to proceed to a bid because they do not think it's a fair and competitive bid?
No one has conveyed that message to us, Mr. Mookhey.
Okay. Mr. Pratt, just to go back to the sort of, I guess, mainline question around the NGF, I welcome your comment around a revision of the policy here. Given that we have record $117 billion of gross debt before the effects of the current lockdown, what scale is the Treasury contemplating of using the debt retirement fund for its intended purposes of reducing debt?
This is an issue that we will work through, and I might say, you may be aware, Mr. Mookhey, we have an asset and liability committee in Treasury. That purpose is to constantly review the balance sheet. It meets monthly and it makes recommendations to both myself and the Treasurer in conjunction with working with T Corp and Mr. Deverell. So that's an ongoing process. I will bring recommendations together for the Treasurer in the next approximately 8 weeks.
So, but it is the case right now that if we were to reduce debt by using the debt retirement fund for its purpose, we'd be more likely to get back our AAA credit rating, wouldn't we?
Look, I can't speak for the rating agencies. What I would say is that the NGF gets full debt offset, so we are given credit for that fund by both rating agencies today.
Sure. Do we have that figure about the government contribution for the coming year?
Let me just check.
No, I haven't got it yet, no.
Okay,
So
well,
I'm reading the budget papers. Thank you. I'm reading the budget papers and I'm looking specifically, to be very technical for all my colleagues, I'm looking very specifically at the line item on page A19 that says cash flows from investments in financial assets for liquidity purposes. And it says that we are effectively buying an additional $7.2 billion of financial assets this year. And that's despite only a cash surplus of $1.8 billion. Can we therefore infer that the government has made a policy decision to borrow an additional $4 billion to effectively cycle into the NGF and invest it in a bunch of global markets?
I think we've been clear that the government cannot borrow money to put directly into the NGF.
I'm not suggesting directly, Mr. Mitter. I'm suggesting very strongly that the government is indirectly doing that.
Well, the two different time horizons. We are borrowing to meet our capital requirements and the capital program that we have, which is short-term borrowing, while the NGF is being grown for a medium to a long term. So they're two separate things.
I appreciate that, Mr. Mitter. But the reason I ask you this question is because I looked at how much financial assets we are buying in net terms this budget, and I compared it to the last budget, and it shows that in between the two budgets, which is in effect 6 months, the government has chosen to buy an additional $21 billion of financial assets. They're increasing the purchasing in just the last 6 months. So my point is has the government made a deliberate policy choice to increase the size of our financial asset base by $21 billion in the last 6 months?
No. So sorry, can I just so I think you're looking at the cash flow statement. when you're coming to those numbers. Yeah, so the cash flow statement kind of varies on a daily basis as the cash requirements change. It could be, proceeds from asset sales. It could be proceeds from dividends going into the fund. So it could be purchase of assets within the funds. So this is a very hard to come to, I guess, the kind of conclusion that you have reached on that this is specifically going in. This is the operating cash flow statement where funds move in and out to manage the day-to-day cash flow requirement of the government.
I accept that you might disagree with me on this, but this is what the major rating agencies have published in the last 3 weeks. This is what major banks have been publishing, including today, saying that the result of the government's policy decision has been to effectively use debt to increase the size of the NGF. Do you disagree with those agencies and those institutions?
Yes, we disagree with that.
Okay. Can I just ask, did the government abolish the NGF Advisory Board?
Yes, it did, Mr. Mookhey.
And that was a board chaired by Dr. Glenn Stevens, correct?
Yes, and then Mr. Stevens joined the T Corp board.
So why did the government abolish the advisory board?
The board had two purposes, really. It was really to set up the NGF initially, and to work through the SAA, the Strategic Asset Allocation Approach with T Corp. And secondly, it was the administration of the community fund. Why
wasn't the abolition of the board chaired by Dr. Stevens announced?
I think the closure of the MCP was announced in the media, which was the My Community project.
I would have thought there would have been some announcement, Mr. Mookhey. I'd have to check on that. I can't recall.
Well, look, I can't find one. So it's possible that I'm wrong. So if on notice, can you please provide us where precisely you announced the decision to abolish the board chaired by Dr. Glenn Stevens?
We'll take that on notice. Thank you.
Thank you. As a result of the choice to abolish that particular board, as you were making reference to before, Mr. Pratt, I just assume now that the Asset and Liability Committee of Treasury is responsible for setting the policy and the risk thresholds?
That's correct, and then it works with T Corp on those settings, which are finally signed off by the Treasurer.
Sure. And T Corp, are they on the ALCO?
Yes, they are.
Mr. Mookhey, I just clarify.
And T Corp is the asset manager, right?
That's correct.
So isn't that a pretty obvious conflict of interest that the body that's meant to be oversighting the performance of the fund manager includes the fund manager?
Mr. Gardner, do you want to comment on? Mr. Gardner chairs the ALCO committee.
Obviously, T Corp is the execution arm of government. It would be remiss of us not to have their expertise sitting on the ALCO.
Well, they're a standing member of the body that's meant to be oversighting their performance. Will not be permitted in any other organisation, best I can tell.
Well, Mr. Pratt and I are both on the board of T Corp. The arrangements between T Corp and Treasury, are very close in terms of the need to have them participate in the overall governance. There's a lot of things that we do at the ALCO which are outside of just this investment strategy work. And at the end of the day, we are taking advice from T Corp and from specialists within Treasury to advise the Secretary and the Treasurer. It's entirely warranted from our perspective.
Mr. Mookhey, could I just add, I mean, it's a good question. Could I just add, if this was a decision-making forum, I tend to agree with you. But this is an advisory body only, and David Deverell's expertise is very helpful in that respect. But the actual decisions are made through me to the Treasurer. So the ALCO committee does not make decisions of itself.
Thank you for clarifying that. Just
clarifying. In the Treasurer's message to the last NGF board, he did announce that the board was being dissolved. So it's in the first page of the last annual report.
I appreciate that, Mr. Gardner. That's helpful. I'll be sure to read it again. Can I just ask, how much fees has T Corp charged the NGF to manage its investments in each of the last years?
I'll get Mr. Deverell to answer that, Mr. Mookhey.
Yeah, it's Mr. Deverell here. So T Corp plays two roles for the government. One is we manage the government's debt debt raising
Yes,
issues.
no, look,
Debt
Mr.
raising.
Deverill, I don't wish to be rude. I just have limited time, and it was
Oh,
a very
sorry.
specific question.
Okay.
What fees has T Corp charged the NGF to manage its investments?
Okay. So we charge the T Corp earns a fee of 0.045%, so 4.5 basis points. So on a balance of about $15 billion, that equates to roughly $6 or $7 million per annum. That's the fee that
Sure.
we
And
charge
so
for managing the fund.
0.45% of
0.04,
basis points.
so it's 4.5 basis points.
Sure, 4.5 basis points of funds under management, correct?
That's correct.
So if funds under management increases, T Corp earns more fees, doesn't it?
The revenues of T Corp increase as funds under management grow. That's the same for the NGF. It's the same for all of the 15 portfolios that we manage that total around about $110 billion on behalf of government.
Yeah, look, I'm not
funds.
suggesting that it's novel, but thank you for clarifying. But doesn't that then provide another conflict of interest in terms of the government relying on T Corp for advice?
I'm afraid I don't understand. So I think is the suggestion here that
aren't you incentivised to recommend the government not to clear debt and not to withdraw funds?
No, I'm not at all. Just to help you, the incentive structure that I have a base salary, and then I have a incentive reward component.
Mr. Deverill, I will get to your incentive structure. I was meaning more your organisation's incentive structure at this point in time. Doesn't T Corp as an organisation have an incentive to advise government not to reduce the amount of funds T Corp is managing, as it will result in a reduction of revenue to T Corp?
No, it doesn't. That is incorrect.
Okay. Well, now that you raised the question around your own KPIs, I do appreciate the Treasurer answering a question about this, which I hope that and I do want to just place on the record, Mr. Deverill, my thanks to you as well for being forthcoming in that information as well, which is a pleasant attitude, I've got to say, and it wasn't, for what it's worth, forthcoming about Tahi, and it was very forthcoming about T Corp. So I do appreciate that. As I understand it, you do have a fixed remuneration component, and that is publicly available, but you also are entitled to earn bonuses, which is worth 60% of your fixed remuneration. What are the KPIs that you have to meet in order to obtain that?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mookhey. So my remuneration is made up of a fixed component, which in the notice I gave yesterday was $780,000. And then I have the capacity to earn up to 60% of that, maximum of 60%. In FY20, that was 291,000. So that was the numbers that we provided through. The basis for determining that incentive reward are based on a balanced scorecard in FY20. So the biggest single component of that was investment performance. That's investment performance in percentage terms relative to client investment objectives. So there is no incentive for me to, or the organisation, to increase funds under management. It's all based upon the performance of the funds relative to the client's investment objectives, measured on a 4-year rolling period. So that's the first one. The second one, the second most important category, is the implementation of strategic initiatives across T Corp, and there are a range of other measures around customer feedback. There was a specific measure also around the reduction of fund manager fees that we get charged for the management of monies that we look after. All of these add together to end up with an overall score. And for the financial year of FY20, that number was, for me, was roughly, I achieved 62% was the outcome. But there is no relation between the size of the business, either in terms of revenues from the financial market side of the business or the investment management side of the business. There is no relation between that and my incentive reward.
Sure. Just finally on this question then, but you do have a profitability KPI, don't you?
8% of the score in FY20 was related to profits after tax relative to budget. And so the budget is set at the beginning of each year with respect to the borrowing forecast and the investment numbers that come out of the budget supplied by Treasury. So the extent to which revenues might go up and they're measured in the budget, those are automatically adjusted. Our challenge then is to manage the expenses of the organisation to marry up with those revenues that are expected to come in as per the budget.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Look, I just do appreciate the candour and thoroughness of your answer there as well, just to place that on record.
I appreciate it too, Mr. Mookhey, because there has been some misinformation about my remuneration structure in the press recently. So thank you for clearing that up.
Sure. Can I just ask about the asset allocation of the NGF? I saw that the last annual report we had approximately 41% in equities. I think it was 14% Australian, 20 international and 6% emerging. What's the existing asset allocation between those equity markets?
The Australian equity allocation is heading down. So we'll keep the allocation to equities roughly around about that 40% level. But for the purposes of diversification, because what we're trying to do is meet the client investment objective within their envelope of risk that they have allocated.
Strategic asset allocation? What is the client's strategic asset allocation for international equities, Australian equities and emerging market equities?
We'll be reducing the Australian equities down to about 8%. The remainder will be global equities.
So, okay, so we are halving it, are we, effectively?
For Australia?
Yes.
Yep. Significant reduction because you don't get the benefit of diversification by investing in the Australian market that you do with offshore.
Can I just ask, which emerging markets are we investing in both equities and debt? I see that we have 6% of emerging market debt, and we had, I think, about the same as emerging market equities. Can you tell us which markets we are going in?
The emerging market debts, so we have developed markets and we have emerging markets that are frontier markets. So typically some of the emerging markets might include countries such as Korea, those sorts of emerging markets, but certainly not what you would call frontier markets. If you want me to give you an exact description of exactly the allocations by country, I can do that. I can take that on notice.
I would, and I appreciate it. Thank you.
No problems.
Thank you. So we're now back to crossbench time. Mr. Shoebridge.
Well, thanks very much, Chair. I hope I'm coming through reasonably clearly. It's a bit patchy at my end.
All good.
Mr. Pratt, thanks, Chair. Mr. Pratt, the bulk of my questions will be to you, but if you find it necessary to refer it to someone else, of course, that's open to you. We found from the fairly disastrous performance of iCare over the last few years that it needs close oversight. Have you been tracking iCare's financial performance, particularly in relation to workers' compensation, to see what the impact of COVID has been on its financial viability?
I appreciate you directing it to me. I'll need to get Mr. Gardner to talk to that, Mr. Shoebridge.
Mr. Gardner here. Good morning or good afternoon, Mr. Shoebridge. So one of the recommendations that came out of the McDougall review is that CIRA and Treasury, work together to stress test the assumptions in the iCare business plan, and so we are currently putting that process in place. We've been working closely with both CIRA and iCare to ensure that we can do that. But you also have to note that the workers' compensation scheme, the nominal insurance scheme, is not sort of in the direct oversight of the Treasury.
Can't hear you. I'm sorry. Oh, that's better. Right.
Sorry, it's coming through rather haphazardly at my end. It probably is my connection. So do you know what the current projected deficit or funding ratio is for iCare for its workers' compensation division?
I'm not aware of the nominal insurer's funding ratio, no.
Can you provide that on notice? And
I just reiterate that obviously sits outside of our sort of remit and oversight. So we can seek that information from CIRA and iCare, yes, on notice.
Chair, I might just drop out and take the second half of the crossbench questions and hand this bit to Mr. Latham because my connection is quite poor. So I'm sorry about that, if that's okay.
Yes, that's fine. Mr. Latham.
Thank you. I'm at the ready. Coming to you, Mr. Pratt, back on that statement you made earlier that it was early days on outcome-based budgeting in New South Wales. The outcome-based budgeting was announced in 2019 budget, wasn't it? So it's now 2 budgets ago. Is that right?
That's correct. But the reason I made that comment, Mr. Latham, is that this has been a massive piece of work. You know, when you cut up a 92 billion thereabouts budget into outcomes and you want to report on all those outcomes, you can appreciate that takes some time.
Yep, well, we've had 2 years, and the first cab off the rank was the Department of Education. And going to the budget paper number 2, the outcome statement, looking at the Department of Education in vocational education and training, there are 3 indicators there, graphed on pages 211 and 212, and they're all in decline. That our VET outcomes measured here are all dipping downwards. Now, after 2 years of outcome-based budgeting in the Department of Education, what is the intervention that Treasury makes to say your outcomes are negative, these indicators are distressing, the policies must be problematic? What are the interventions to actually change policy to improve the outcomes?
Well, a number of things. Treasury has discussions with its relationship managers with each of the clusters. So the education team in Treasury would be discussing those outcomes with the education department, responsible people. Secondly, the Secretary of Education would report back on this through Secretary's Board and progress that they're making. And I would imagine there'll be other forums within education itself with the Education Minister that I'm not a party to, where these things would be discussed.
Can you take on notice what the results of the discussions might be that change policy direction to improve the outcomes? And can I take you to the Stronger Communities Cluster 7.9 of the budget paper number 2? You know, one of the terrible, terrible shames in our state is the large number of children, young people at risk of significant harm, many tens of thousands of them around the state. And over the past 5 years, the proportion of children and young people re-reported at risk of significant harm within 12 months has not moved. It's still at 40%. So what happens there in an absolutely critical area of child welfare, you know, the most important responsibility you can have in the public sector and public life, to try and improve that number, to bring down the re-reporting ratio, to protect our children so they can sleep safely at night.
No, look, obviously I fully agree, Mr. Latham, and look, what I can say is that Michael Coates-Trotter, the Secretary of that cluster, has a really laser focus on both the children's issue and domestic violence. There is regular reporting that goes to Secretary's Board on this, and I'm happy to come back with those actions through Mr. Coates-Trotter if you'd like me to. I'll take it on notice, but I just want to reassure you there is a very strong focus by that cluster on these issues.
Yeah, but we hear a lot about the laser-like focus, of course, but it's supposed to result in measured improvements in outcomes, in this case for vulnerable young children. So I hope your reply on notice actually goes to that question of outcomes. And can I just take you to 7.8 of the same document, where, you know, despite enormous effort and expenditure in domestic violence, the number of people charged with a domestic violence assault who had an earlier domestic assault charge in the last 12 months, so these are repeat offenders, it's anchored over the past 5 years at 1,800. Why is that?
Well, it's really a question for the cluster, but I mean, as you'd appreciate, these are incredibly complex and difficult issues. And you don't turn the dial quickly on this, but what I can say, it is getting the attention that you'd hope it would. I mean, these questions are directly for the clusters. I will take on notice what I can get for you. But from what I see, and I really appreciate you asking about outcomes, because that's the language we want around government. So the more you do that, the better we're going to be. So thank you.
In these stubborn failed policy areas, is there a priority in the Treasury's approach to outcome-based budgeting that you take vulnerable children and the domestic violence problem as absolute priorities to drive improved outcomes under output-based budgeting?
What I can say is that education and stronger communities have been the 2 key areas of initial focus. and largely for reasons that you've just outlined. So they are the clusters that we've been focusing on principally.
And just in terms of transparency and proper budgeting, why is it at budget paper number 146? Under new revenue measures, you list domestic and family violence funding, $40 million increased outlays for each of the last 2 years. Why is that regarded as a revenue measure?
I'd have to get Mr. Minor to check that.
Yeah, I'll check that and come back to you. I'm sorry, I'll need to take that on notice. Look at that specific line.
Okay, yeah, it just seems very curious and unusual to have an expenditure in such an important area as a revenue measure. Could I ask more generally? Yeah.
So some of this could be Commonwealth funding coming in, so therefore it appears as a revenue line. So when Commonwealth funding comes in for those measures, it comes in as a revenue line.
Right. Okay. Thank you. No, that makes sense. So that's not state effort. It's Commonwealth funding to New South Wales. Thank you. Could I ask, for anyone who can answer it, why is the current budget forecasting a 22% increase in transfer duty, what we used to know as stamp duty on homes?
Yes, I'll get Ms. Wilkie to talk to that. Thank you.
So the increase in transfer duty in the budget papers is as a result of the previous decline that had been forecast. So it's basically because we're forecasting expectations for transactional activity, so additional volume, which has been much stronger in recent months, leading up to the budget in comparison to the forecast we did for the half-year review. So that's why the increase in volume. So we saw a decrease in sales and forecast activity in the lead up to half-year review, which was then increased prior to the budget.
And what's the impact of the current lockdown on your revenue forecast for transfer duty and right across the entire budget and flowing on to a bigger budget deficit?
So that work is being undertaken at the moment, and the forecasting round will start. The formal forecasting round will start in earnest, as Mr. Pratt said earlier, for the half-year review over the course of the next month. The revenue forecasts depend quite a lot on the economic forecasts. As Mr. Walters said earlier, the formal forecasting round for economic activity for the half-year review has not yet commenced. So while we monitor revenue intake in real time, the forecasts are undertaken more periodically, but given that we have seen a decrease in economic activity, we do expect to see some decreases in revenue, but we at this stage haven't done the revenue lines in detail. We will do that for half-year review.
Right. So generally, you're expecting a pretty sharp deterioration in the budget.
Mr. Latham's time.
Mr. Latham, you have that is not what I said. I did not say what you just said. That I said you have misrepresented my statement.
Oh, sorry about that. But what are you expecting the improvement in the budgetary position?
Mr. Latham, that is not what I said either.
No, but that's a question, you see. That's not my statement. I'm asking, what's your expectation of the budgetary position as a result of the lockdown we've currently got, which looks like it'll go to Christmas?
The budget position or the revenue position, Mr. Latham?
Well, both. They're related, revenue and budget.
Well, budget depends on both expenses and revenue. So my expectation is that we will see a deterioration in the revenue position.
Okay, so we'll have to, sorry, we're out of time for this part. So back to Mr. Shoebridge.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks for everyone's indulgence. Mr. Pratt, so do I understand it that you're not getting regular reports? Despite the experience we've had over the last few years, you're not getting regular reports about the financial position of the nominal insurer?
There is work underway. I mean, one of the outcomes of the reviews, as you know, is for Treasury to engage itself in a more detailed review of the plan. That work is underway, and Mr. Gardner's leading that work. But as far as I'm aware, there is ongoing reporting coming through to Treasury on the performance of the NI. Let me just check with Mr. Gardner on that.
That's right. I mean, Mr. Pratt and I have, sorry, it's Mr. Gardner here again. Mr. Pratt and I have monthly meetings with the CEO and senior executive of iCare. We talk verbally through a lot of the significant issues, including efforts to remediate, the program of remediation work around NI. And so we're fully aware of that program of work, and there's a lot of those have a crossover into the TMF, and so to the extent we do there, then you know, we sort of working closely with them and CIRA on a number of different issues. So we are not parking this off to the side. There's a high degree of attention and focus on this program.
So Mr. Shoebridge.
Time is limited, Mr. Pratt. So I ask again, what's the current financial status of the nominal insurer? What's its funding ratio? But you don't know that.
Well, it's that that is information that iCare and CIRA are best positioned to respond to you on, Mr. Shoebridge.
Have you sought information about the COVID impact? For example, do you know the number of COVID-related claims that have been met by iCare?
I'm unaware of that, Mr. Shoebridge.
Given there are moves afoot, many of them supported across politics, to require compulsory vaccination for nurses, for childcare workers, have you taken steps to ensure that those workers will be protected by workers' compensation if they have an adverse reaction to the vaccine that's required for work? Have you taken those steps?
Mr. Shoebridge, I'm aware of conversations that iCare is participating in with the Department of Health, and I'd suggest you direct questions to those parties.
Can you give any data at all, given Treasury's role, in terms of the connection between the Treasurer and iCare? Can you give any data at all about the number of workers' compensation claims related to COVID, and in particular, how many of them have used the deeming provisions that Parliament put in last year?
Yeah, we'll have to take those questions around that sort of data level of granularity of data on notice. I'd note, I mean, the committee didn't request Mr. Harding to join us. He would be a far better source of that information.
Mr. Pratt, has Treasury looked at what the cost to the New South Wales Treasury would be of providing meaningful stay-at-home payments for people, particularly in Western and Southwestern Sydney, in order to provide the financial security for people to stay at home? Has New South Wales Treasury done any modelling?
Not that I'm aware, no.
Given that one of the major reasons we're seeing COVID being transmitted, particularly in Western and Southwestern Sydney, is people feeling they are economically compelled to continue to work, even if they would prefer to stay at home, how is it the Treasury hasn't actually started costing this in order to protect us in this public health crisis?
Well, Treasury is rightly largely directed by the health directions, as you appreciate, in terms of health policy. This is evolving and continues to evolve very quickly. I mean, an example of what I'm talking about now is we've recently just instigated a vaccine and isolate policy, so there is a payment for that. And these are things that we're working closely with health in. On this specific issue, let me check with Mr. Walters, but I'm not sure that we've been asked to model any of that at this point.
No, that's right, Mr. Pratt, we haven't.
No, we haven't, Mr.
What does the modelling show the take-up will be for the stay-at-home payment? And what if any, testing was done to see if that was anything like adequate to provide the necessary financial security for people to stay at home?
Mr. Shoebridge, as I indicated earlier, all the modelling work is cabinet in confidence, so I'm unable to share any of that work.
Mr. Shoebridge, the test and isolate payment is a health measure, so those questions are best directed to the health department. It's a public health measure.
But surely Treasury has to work out what the predicted uptake will be. Can you tell us what the predicted uptake will be? What it's actually going to cost?
Mr. Shoebridge, the predicted uptake is not dependent on the sort of modelling that Treasury would undertake in that space is based on economic activity. In this case, the uptake of a test and isolate policy payment is actually dependent on what is happening in the public health aspects of what, in terms of how many cases there are or people who might have symptoms and need to go and get tested. So again, those are questions that are the purview of the public health team in the health department, not Treasury.
Moving to a different matter. The New South Wales government provided a $5.5 million grant to the Australian Clay Target Association, which to provide a conference centre outside Wagga Wagga. What was Treasury's role in approving that, and when were decisions made within Treasury to approve that funding?
I have to take that on notice, Mr. Shoebridge.
When the current Premier was Treasurer, what role did she have in the assessment, the review, or the approval of that $5.5 million grant?
Again, I would take that on notice. I'm not able to comment on that.
Do you know if Treasury had a role in the initial political approval in 2016 of that $5.5 million grant, and if so, what role it had?
I'm not aware, no.
Given the notoriety around this, have you sought a review about the adequacy of Treasury oversight for the handing out of $5.5 million in this case?
No, I have not.
Do you think that would be prudent, given the degree of notoriety around this $5.5 million grant, or is a $5.5 million grant not sufficient to raise that kind of concerns within Treasury?
Well, many of these grants do not come through Treasury process. They are approved within particular clusters of government. So it would not be unusual, as you'd appreciate, for Treasury not to have line of sight to these things.
But I assume in this regard you're speculating because you say you don't know Treasury's role. Can you give us a detailed chronology of what Treasury's role was and who the decision makers in Treasury were in relation to this grant?
I will certainly commit to giving you what I can, Mr. Shoebridge, yes.
Thank you, Mr. Grant. That concludes my questions.
Okay, thank you, everybody. It's now a window for the government if they choose. Great. In which case we have finished this hearing today. Thank you very much to all of our officials and witnesses who have joined us today to participate. The Secretariat will be in touch with you in relation to the questions that were taken on notice and how you can respond to those in the timeline for that. Thank you again for the work that you do and for time today. Yes.
Sorry, I just thought I heard the Treasury officials sort of say that they might have some additional information, or hint that they might have some additional information.
Yes, happy, Mr. Pratt, or any others. Did you want to?
I think Mr. Myers might have had one piece of information.
Yes, you're welcome. Yeah.
I was just going to clarify Mr. Latham's question around procurement savings. That policy was in last year's budget, which is why it wasn't specifically spelled out in this year's budget, but the details are there. Those savings continue into this year. So
but it's not a budget measure. It's not a budget measure for the current budget.
No, it's not.
10 years ago, but it's not relevant to say it was in last year's budget. These are measures for this year's. So it's 145 expenditure, no savings.
Okay, everybody. So we'll be having a debate about that. If you want to clarify anything, Treasury officials, you're welcome to. But otherwise, we will wrap up.
We'll leave it there, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks everybody for your attendance. I will now declare this hearing closed.